He didn't sit down with the head of Panama to discuss the Canal or the head of Denmark to discuss. He announced. And he's made a career out of being a naughty boy. And the working class loves it because they felt abandoned, which they had been. The Democrats are as responsible for Mr. Trump as anybody else. And Mr. Trump won because he managed this symbolism very well. I am naughty. I am not of that establishment. I hate them like you do.
We last spoke on the show a few months ago, just before the 2024 election. And at the time, the crucial word you used to describe Donald Trump was irrelevant. And I believe, you should correct me if I'm mistaken, that the point there was that he was just going to be some sort of blip in history. And I'm wondering if now, in 2025, you're still feeling that he's irrelevant.
Yep, I am. I don't think that. I don't think he has a clue. I'm mostly amazed by the collection of people he has brought with him, because I wait for somebody in that group, and that may still emerge, but I wait for somebody who seems to me, at least, to have a sense of a strategic perspective that understands the basic problems and comes up with a plan of how to deal with them. I'm not expecting a plan that's foolproof, a plan that can't fail, and nothing like that, but just a kind of coherent assessment of what the problems are, connected to a coherent plan. The economic problems faced by the United States now are incredible in their multiplicity, in their seriousness, in how many of the problems have not been addressed for a long time. But I don't see, other than verbiage, the verbiage is endless, a sort of an explosion of verbiage, but I don't see it. So I don't think whatever he does is going to make much of a difference to what's going on. Here and there it will have impact, horrible in some cases, perhaps beneficial in others, but as a comprehensive assessment of the problem and the strategy, no, I don't see it. And so my conclusion is that the hodgepodge of policies, and that's what it is, a hodgepodge of mutually contradictory, weird proposals that are much more two things: continuations of what worked for him as a candidate, plus doubling down on where he got himself into trouble. It seems to, if I can discern a strategy, that's it. What worked to get me in should work to keep me going. A big mistake. And doubling down where I didn't succeed before, or where I've been got pushback, doesn't strike me as a brilliant move either. It's a kind of mechanical response to somebody who hopes that this approach will somehow work. People have been asking me, and the image I like is Donald Trump was told that there is this thing in football called a Hail Mary pass. That's when the quarterback, in a tough situation, just leans back and heaves the ball downfield as far as possible, tells his confederates on the team, those that are responsible, go into this direction, go to the left corner. Let's hope you're where the ball comes down or where it bounces into your head. And, sometimes that works. Is it possible that what Mr. Trump does will actually produce the outcome he tells us it will? Sure. It's not a zero possibility. But then we don't miss Mr. Trump, because that's almost true for anybody certainly would have been true for Mr. Biden or Kamala Harris or anybody else. It's not a coherent And I'd be glad to explain how and why that is, but it's a strange amalgam of contradictions. And the only reason I have to say that is because the media in this country want to give him, as a new president or a returned president, the benefit of the doubt, or maybe some leeway, or the first 100 days. And so they don't do what they should do. I think that will change as the impacts of what he does become clearer, but for the moment, no.
You said a lot of things that I want to get back to, such as this hodgepodge of strategies and his cabinet picks. But stepping back for a moment, one of the things that I've really come to enjoy doing on the show, even though many listeners seem to hate it, is discuss both sides of an issue. And so my last interview was with Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution, and we talked about Trump and the election and what to expect going forward, and that's one of the topics that you and I are going to discuss. Before I tell you some of the things he thought, which I expect you might disagree with,
I would hope so.
I am curious to hear why you think, after the fact now, Trump won the election and Harris lost.
Harris made a strategic choice to be the continuation of Joe Biden. I understand what many of the considerations were that led her to make that decision. And when I say her, I mean the entourage around her that helps her make strategic decisions, which all candidates have. And I think, if I had to pick a single thing, what the American people want is change. An awful lot of them want change. And Mr. Trump, not by the programs he comes up with so much, but the bluster, the bullying, the over-the-top language, the endless symbolism. And so Kamala Harris undercuts this by insisting, under pressure, that she is the continuation of Joseph Biden. That was a mistake. Biden was nothing. Biden was same old, and by that I don't mean Democrat. It's like George Bush or Clinton or Obama. It's what a majority of Americans, in different ways and for different reasons, they don't want more of that. They want something else. And I think, in a country like ours, which has its Cold War legacy, which I would define as follows: a liberal consensus on both sides, the kind of moderate Republicans and the usual Democrats, moving steadily to the right, both of them, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, in a program I would call the undoing of the New Deal, which they did together. What the lesson was to the mass of people is there is an establishment. We have Tweedledum and Tweedledee. We oscillate between the Republican and the Democrat. Nothing much changes. And if you do want to change, the only allowable place is to go to the right, because the left was anathema. The left was evil. We had a purge of people on the left after World War II. Very serious. We didn't have a comparable purge of people on the right. The American people were taught there's really two options: this consensus and the right. You see that in many European countries too. You've developed, they copied the United States, you developed this core middle. But if people don't want the middle anymore and begin to ask themselves, what else is there? What they've had, what has been available, is the right-wing alternative, so they go there. If you develop a serious left-wing alternative, then you're going to see, which is going to shock people, but it shouldn't, you're going to see that a good percentage of those who went to the right will go to the left, because that alternative is more attractive to them. And the best example we see right now is France. the people in France who are in power, the big bloc in the assembly, majority bloc. No, that's wrong. Plurality blocks. It's not a majority. Is the left. It put four parties together, ran them as a unified party, and ends up the largest bloc in the assembly, to the shock and the end of Mr. Macron's career, for sure, etc. And there's no reason to believe that that's unique to France. You see a right wing in France, to show the point, but it's not big enough. The left wing is bigger. Nobody should be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened here. But for that to happen, there has to be one of the things that was foreclosed in this country, which is a left wing, because it was rendered the evil communist other for so long that nobody has had yet the key to bring the existing left into a position where it could be an alternative change from the consensus. So Mr. Trump sits there all alone. Another way to understand it, which is consistent, is to see that in the second part of the undoing of the New Deal, the Democratic Party succeeded in attracting the support and the money of a large number of American megacorporations. They had always favored the Republicans. They still do. If you look at where the money goes, it's very clear. But the Democrats were able to get Silicon Valley, portion of them, and others. And that was an existential threat to the Republicans. Because if the Democrats can continue to get the unions, the women, the minorities, a disproportionate number of working class people, and they get the money, the Republicans are done. What they can get, given their history, the Christian conservatives, the white supremacists, and so on, they're dead. They lose, and they did one election after another. So they made the decision, or rather Trump did, or the people around him, okay, if an end run of the Democrats was to get some of our supporters the money, we've got to do a comparable end run around them, which we will. We'll start talking to the working class. We'll outdo the Democrats with the working class the way they have outdone us with the financial supports we used to count on to be a viable political operation. And that's what happened. Mr. Trump talks, going to bring back jobs here, and he's going to get rid of those awful immigrants that contest and destroy.
And eat pets.
Yes, that too. That's right. I forgot. It's already several months old. But no, look at the symbolism. He has an airplane in which he has a hapless group of apparently Colombian immigrants here, puts them in shackles. Their crime is they're immigrants, which in most parts of the world is not a crime. It's not even clear it's a crime here. That would have to be determined unless the old premise of innocent until guilty has been absorbed too. And he dumps them on a runway at an airport in Colombia. I mean, what? You didn't sit down with the Colombians to work? You just dumped them on? And the answer is yes. He didn't sit down with the head of Panama to discuss the Canal or the head of Denmark to discuss. He announced, this is naughty boy. This is naughty boy. And he's made a career out of being a naughty boy. He's upset that he's treated like a naughty boy and then acts like a naughty boy, which is not all that unusual among naughty boys. So that's what we have symbolically. And the working class loves it because they felt abandoned, which they had been. The Democrats are as responsible for Mr. Trump as anybody else. And it should be understood for the historical moment that it is. And I think Mr. Trump won because he managed this symbolism very well. I am naughty. I am not of that establishment. I hate them like you do. They have abused me personally, just like you. And Kamala Harris can't, she would have had to develop a different persona, a different projection. She didn't do that. I'm not privy, so I don't know what her calculations were, but I think they were wrong. I think she lost the election, not because Mr. Trump became more popular, but because her side became less so. And so the votes, there were fewer voters and blah, blah, blah. And he was able to make inroads among young voters and black voters, more than enough. And he only won by 1.5% of the vote. He has to create the mandate verbally because he doesn't have it in reality. But with him, you never quite know whether he grasps the boundary between the fantasy and the BS and the reality, or whether he really thinks, as other presidents have, that he can now create the reality. It conveniently conforms to how he would like it to be. A lot of people make that mistake.
Before we return to this narrative of change, which I find very compelling, and I guess it might actually be involved in this conversation, in this coming question, and also Victor Davis Hanson, who I just mentioned.
Right.
You referred to unions, and in our last conversation, you anticipated that the unions would be in support of Biden. And I wanted to ask why then, for instance, a union like the Longshoremen's Union ended up going for Trump.
Well, the unions have been on decline in this country. If you look at membership, which is not the only measure, but it's an important measure, they've been on decline for half a century. I mean, that has put them in an impossible situation. Their traditions in this country had to do with servicing your members, filing grievances, representing your workers with the employer, getting better wages, working conditions. And that takes time and energy and staff. And the only way you pay for that is if you have members who pay dues. So if you're losing your membership for 50 years, and the line is literally, a little blips, but it's basically a line of 50-year decline. I believe their peak was in 1955 or around there, and it's been downhill ever since. In the private sector, which is a major part of our economy, union membership is 7% or less of the labor force. That means 93% of private employees are not represented by a union. Well, the unions are bankrupt then. They don't have them. Where are they going to get the money to sustain the staff, which could provide the services that could sustain the union? When you put that together with the post-Depression rollback of the New Deal, remember, 1947 is crucial. It's the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, whose provisions most people don't know, but you really ought to go back if you're interested and look at them. There are things such as, if you're a communist, you can't be a leader of a union. Well, hello, friends. Communists are the people who usually lead unions and do so in a militant way. Who else would you expect? Communists with a small c, whether or not they're members of a communist party. And even bigger, the Taft-Hartley Act said anything won by a union at a workplace, any wage increase, any working condition improvement, has to be given to everybody working there, whether they joined the union and pay dues or not. What? Yeah. And by the way, not just shame on the employer class for having come together to support these bills, which is why they passed, but also the unions themselves. Did they not understand what this would do to them? Did it take 50 years of observing the results? The answer is they accommodated to the conditions they faced. And those conditions were a society that had gone through a trauma, the collapse of its own capitalist system in the Great Depression, and the decision of the employer class that what had happened there must never be allowed to happen again. What happened there was a mass of people cut an alliance with Mr. Roosevelt and got their Social Security. We talked about this last time. And all of that Social Security, unemployment compensation, the 10 million or 12 million workers hired by the government, all of the money for that was taken from the rich, the corporations and the rich, whose taxes were raised and who were required to loan what they didn't pay in taxes. Okay, they don't want that to ever happen again. And they went to work with a kind of unanimity and a kind of commitment that comes out of being frightened, badly frightened by what they observed. Yeah, this is hard to get across to Americans, but what for those people they observed was the equivalent of what Europeans observed with Nazis marching through their streets. A shock, a horror for many, and a shifting of the way you think about the world and yourself in it. And they made a decision, very impressive, and they carried it through. They demonized the left. Look, many of the people hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee, believe it or not, that's what it was called. Not my language. They chose an Un-American Activities Committee. They were going to decide what's American and what isn't, and they were going to punish, imprison, deport, all kinds of things they did with those who were deemed un-American. They went after the coalition that produced the New Deal. It was a coalition of the Democratic Party, Mr. President Roosevelt, the union movement, which he encouraged, led by the CIO, which was then the dominant union experience, and there's two socialists and one communist party. That was the New Deal coalition. People interested in civil rights, women wanting the end of sexism, found their places within those institutions, Socialist Party, Communist Party, Labor Movement. And that had to be smashed to bits. And they went systematically. What was the weakest link of that coalition? The Communist Party, because that could be linked to the great new enemy, our former ally, right? And you had to develop a theater. And that theater shaped the American political consciousness. I remember when my son was of an age to go to college, one of the places he wanted to look at was the University of Chicago. So I packed him up and we went to Chicago so that my son could, go around. And they had a little program like they usually do for prospective students. And there was an existing student who took us around, showed us the campus. And at one point, my son, because he's my son, said, well, are there political groups? Asking with all the open honesty and naivete that a 17-year-old would have. And the young man who was taking us around, it was very nice and very helpful, said, yes, we have everything from the, then he mentioned a right-wing, Young Americans for Freedom, a right-wing group, all the way over to the Democratic Party. And for him, and for everybody else, that was it. That was politics. There was nothing further left. Or, same way of saying it, further left takes you out of the conversation into the area of scary, dangerous, evil. Oh, for that. And the young man in the University of Chicago, very American, had absorbed that without understanding what he was doing. He absorbed it. The whole country is that. And that's why when this era of capitalism is over, as I believe it to be, and the dominant position in the United States is over, as I believe it to be, and you turn in with the horror of that, the fear of what that means, well, then you go to the right because that's the alternative to what you have had all along, and you feel the need for a break. Mr. Trump plays that theme endlessly. I'm new, I'm different, I'm with the verbiage and the hyper, 400 presidential orders, each having to reverse them the next morning because didn't think it through. Look at this. It's a spectacle. But it's a spectacle that has its real roots.
Again, I'm just keeping track of all the things we're going to be coming back to. I assume that a big portion of our conversation will be about the end of the American empire and where we are with Trump right now. But now I would like to take this narrative you've given about the election being explained by a desire for change and the inability of Harris and the Democratic Party to provide that. I'd like to connect that to what Victor Davis Hanson said and see if you see any resonance between the two ideas. The way that Victor accounted for the election is he sees it, I think, as part of a larger culture war between, on the one hand, what he referred to as the bi-coastal left-wing intellectual elite, and then on the other side, a more common folk that is simply competence-minded and down-to-earth and cares about skills and success and doesn't care about Ivy League degrees.
And has spokespeople like Mr. Hanson.
He is a farmer.
Yes, well, he is.
He is. So on the one hand,
me too. I have 4 tomato plants. Yeah, go ahead.
On the one hand, I see this as connecting to your idea of change as well, because presumably the right wants change from this obsolete left ruling class. But I wonder if you see a similar culture war afoot at all.
No, I see people like him really trying and stretching to construct such an idea. But in my view, that's because it doesn't work. And they're worried about where all this might go. And this is for them, a much happier story than the one I tell. They don't want to deal with a declining empire. They don't want to deal with a capitalism that doesn't work. They want this to be all in the realm of the bad people on the coasts with their evil elitism versus the men and women of the soil. This game has been played by left-wingers, too. This is a very old way of thinking. He may not know it, but I could give him references if he wants about, where this game has been played before. I don't think the elites, whatever that quite means, on the coast have the power or the understanding to play the nice role of bad guy that his construct assigns to them. And, I understand what he's doing. It's all over the place. I'm sure he didn't claim he was the origin of this inside. He repeats it. And for me, it's empty. Even if you believed it, you'd have to then explain, why do we have people on the coast who do what they do, say what they say, advocate what... You'd have to explain it. What, is there something in the air in California and New York that make them attract? I mean, stop. What is this? And it becomes dangerous, because if it... In the hands of people less scrupulous than I hope Mr. Hanson is, this can become, a rural against urban, an educated against uneducated. That's where this goes in the hands of many, and he will bear responsibility, because giving a veneer of respectability to this way of thinking is cheap in the end. No, I like to ground what I'm saying in what's actually happening in the economic realities of the United States. That, there are for example, there are certain industries that are still viable in the United States. Many industries aren't. Why not? Because capitalists who make these decisions made the decision to relocate their businesses overseas. Or those same capitalists made the decision to automate. Okay, so a whole lot of industries left And much of the unhappiness of the people in the middle of the country is because that's what they left from. Whereas the industries that still can function for all kinds of reasons, because they're service industries. You can't have a service industry in China serving people in America because the industry has to be where the people are. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So we exported manufacturing. We didn't export services, with some exceptions. The industries that are still viable here, high tech, they went to California for all kinds of reasons long ago. So they can expand, they can hire more. Everybody can go live, in San Jose or in the environment. But that's not because, however lovely California's climate, it's because these are industries that are still viable as leadership industries in world capitalism located here. That leadership, by the way, is leaching away. Last week, we all got a lesson when DeepSeek showed us what can be done by those nasty Chinese folks in the way of the high-tech AI revolution. It's not going to be dominated by the United States. That's what the lesson is. But we're going to watch. What is the story the Hansons of this world are going to tell us about China's arrival? They're going to tell us, sadly, that the Chinese copied a lot of the United States, which is true but irrelevant. The newcomer always copies the old one. When the United States broke from Britain, you know what the Britain charged the United States with for the whole 19th century? Stealing our technology, which had its grain of truth. It always does. But this sudden, they're stealing. This is, how awful. What you're really revealing is you don't know anything about your own history. What are you doing? It becomes cheap, and it slides into, well, I'll leave that to the audience to figure out where that stuff slides to. So I understand the effort to make this a culture war is, in my judgment, an attempt to distract attention from other dimensions which not only explain the story better, but help us understand why that culture war even exists. What is its origin, its cause? Otherwise, you start with a culture war. What is that? How are you going to ground that? And by the way, I don't know Mr. Hanson, but that kind of argument then becomes grounded in stories of education. The political complexity of the United States that I've been talking about was not significantly different from the political orientation of my classmates at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. So that's supposedly the elite, but they were as clueless about the left wing as most Americans were, because they were affected by the same culture war against the left that came out of World War II. The most famous economics professor at Harvard at my time was a man with a big reputation named Joseph Schumpeter. You may have heard his name. Okay? Joseph Schumpeter had a prize student at Harvard named Paul Sweezy.
I was hoping you'd say Rick Wolff.
No, Paul Sweezy. They're older than me. I was young, just arriving there. Paul Sweezy who himself was a graduate of Harvard, who was a member of the Rockefeller family, the right one. And so he grew perfect. He's at Harvard getting his degree, comes from the wealthy, and he's the heir apparent to Joseph Schumpeter. At the end of the 1940s, Harvard fires him. He's teaching already. They fire him. They're not going to let him replace Schumpeter as Schumpeter wanted. No. Why? Because he had become a Marxist in the 1930s, as so many had. And Harvard, under the gun and the pressure, had no more backbone then than it has had recently with its other leaders that it dumped when the wind politically changed. And where did Sweezy go? He left Harvard and went to New York City and founded a magazine called the Monthly Review, which still exists, using money given to him by Albert Einstein, who wrote the editorial in the first issue of Monthly Review, which was entitled Why I Am a Socialist. Right? All of that, that's the culture war. But for people to think that the culture war didn't come out of the history of this country is very bizarre. Very bizarre. So I don't, as a proposition, I don't take it serious. As an interesting phenomena of how you avoid, this is the continuation of the taboo on the Marxist or the leftist way of opening up a question. It's an approach that will not debate. In Europe, it's quite different. There, the right has to debate the left. It's too hard. They can't just dismiss it. They try. In good American copying, try to do, because they envy what the United States can do to its working class, because you can't do it there. Right? Europeans have a national health service. Europe doesn't allow the death penalty. European universities are mostly free. Yeah, you can't do to the working class there, and their capitalists are envious. But other than that, the culture war stuff cannot be pursued there the way it is here, because it doesn't have this history.
You mentioned, I mean, as an economist, you tend to support a lot of your arguments with reference to economics.
Absolutely.
Right. And Victor's background, at least in part, is farming. So it was natural for us to talk about the California wildfire disaster, because he could at length explain exactly what's going on with California's water. But the way that he accounted for this situation, and I bring it up just because it's still quite topical, is that you have a situation where the government is at the hands of this bi-coastal, in this case, west coastal elite, and they're ideologically captured and incompetent, and their mismanagement is what led to this tremendous disaster, or at least seriously contributed to it. Whereas if you had people closer to the soil or closer to the water in charge, this disaster would not have expanded to the proportions it has taken out.
But this is simple-mindedness. What is this as an analysis? Bad people made bad decisions. Okay, but why are those bad people in a position to do that? And why did they make the bad decision? Well, what? Where's it? What kind of an analysis? This is not analysis. This is saying there's something really bad happened, and I'm going to tell you who's responsible. Okay. Can we get beyond that? Could you? Okay, well, you pointed at Jack or at, what is it, the elite. Well, how did they get to be the elite? Who didn't get there? Why did that happen? Come on, this is not an analysis. This is substitute. You don't need an analysis. You got the bad guy. I don't have to understand why any of this happened. I got the By the way, that's our criminal justice system. Well, we get the bad guy and we put him in jail. See? Yeah, Jack. You know what the recidivism rate in the country is? That guy in jail going to come out. And you know what jail is going to do? Make him worse. You're not solving any problem. Has jail solved our crime problem? We're a crime-ridden society. Everybody has a gun. That was supposed to solve the problem. Didn't. What are you doing? That Mr. Hanson can sit, and again, I don't know him and I bear him no ill will, but to sit and talk like this, doesn't he feel the need? If he's going to make the bad guy be people in California who have been incompetent. Really? You think incompetence is all on one side of the ledger here? And if they are incompetent, how come they're in this position to do these things as such big incompetence? I mean, the questions that this kind of line of thinking opens up that are not admitted or addressed ought to make you wonder, wow. And again, I'm getting closer to taking offense, because there are ugly versions of this, which are racism. That also pins a whole lot of associations on some group. Well, what? I noticed Mr. Trump said that the problem with immigrants is when they do crime. And then his own FBI had to release the statistics that the crime rate among undocumented immigrants is lower than the crime rate among natives, which would have been the reasonable presumption anyway. Why? Because if you're an undocumented immigrant, you want to keep as far away from the police as, come on. My parents were immigrants. I'm also personally affected by this. And this, by the way, Mr. Hanson knows that this country has a history, serious history, of racism, of blaming people of bad-mouthing every immigrant wave that came here. The English did it to the Irish did it to the Italian. I could go on. And we all know that. We really do. We invented the melting pot because we were so upset by what the reality was. Okay, it still is in large parts of the country. So, what are you doing? The culture war means you're inventing yet another what? There's something, these people who live in California they're incompetent. Oh, what is racism? Those dark-skinned people, they're not, they're like children. Should I rehash our American South? This is a dangerous way of thinking. I don't think he means it. My suspicion is, like most of people like that, he's ignorant of this country's history. Because if he weren't, he'd be much more hesitant about talking like this, knowing where it comes from and where it might go. It doesn't need some nice, close-to-the-soil farmer to give it validity. It's very dangerous.
I do think that Victor is a very careful thinker, and he's not here, so
yes, for sure.
I can't speak for him, but when I next speak with him, I will certainly raise some of these points to get his opinions.
That's if I were in a room with him.
Right, of course. But before we move on, I am curious to hear, I assume, I know that you're somebody who likes to hear both sides of an issue, who likes to think about things carefully.
I want to learn.
Are there any right-wing thinkers out there today, or political pundits or commentators, who you do find to be genuinely insightful and interesting?
I don't know what generally quite means.
Genuinely.
I don't know what it means. And I'm no judge of how genuine they are. But the guy who used to be on Fox News and then was kicked off, and now
Tucker Carlson?
Yeah, for example. I think sometimes he's very good.
Really?
Yeah.
You like Tucker? Well, might be a strong word.
No, that's why I said genuine, and how genuine, I don't know. But I find it interesting that he sometimes is able to do a piece of analysis very close to my own, from which I have learned. And so, he does it in his way. It's not quite the way I do it. But he alerts me to a relationship that I didn't give that much weight to. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful to anybody who teaches me. So he has on occasion taught me. Other times he says things that I find laughable and of no interest, other than the pathology of this kind of thinking. That's why I don't know about genuine or general. But he's one from whom I have learned. And when I play with the internet and I come across, I usually stop and listen and try to see how they construct. For example, these days I'm very interested in people whose work I have occasionally learned from, as they, in my judgment, slavishly admired Trump in a kind of lopsided enthusiasm that they don't normally show to anything, including ideas and personalities on the right. But for Mr. Trump, they have really almost an adoration that makes them stop being as critical as I know they have been in other circumstances. I assume that will fade after a while, maybe not. But I have always made sure to look at that point of view, to listen to it. I do that I'm interested in Europe particularly, so I've paid attention to the right-wing Marine Le Pen. I read her work sometimes, her statements. In Germany, for Deutschland, you may remember I read French and German, right. So those things are accessible to me. And I make sure to, when there's a character who comes to my attention, Viktor Orban in Hungary. Mostly, though, the leaders of these countries they're not it's not an impressive group, put it that way. There are some exceptions, but not many. And among the contending politicals, the most sophisticated discussion are the French and German, as far as I can tell. I mean, to take seriously Mr. Starmer in England is an effort. I mean, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. I don't want to be unfair. I mean, it's no more or less than Mr. Biden. So.
Something I find funny is that the one reason I asked you about right-wing thinkers is I'm always looking for new and interesting guests. And I thought you might mention somebody I hadn't heard of, but you mentioned Tucker Carlson, which is funny to interpret that. Obviously, this wasn't your intention as an invitation to have Tucker Carlson on the show.
No. But he doesn't need exposure. He doesn't need opportunity because he writes his own and right.
Now, I'd like to ask just two more questions about the election before we move on from the election. And these are things that have come to mind as you've been speaking. I remember that your wife is a therapist.
Yes.
And I also know that you have some interest in psychoanalysis.
Yes.
And you have mentioned a couple of times in this conversation that involved in Trump and his policies is this hodgepodge of contradictions. And what this makes me wonder is whether you think that there's something that psychoanalysis as a form of cultural analysis might tell us about the election. Is there something going on in America's subconscious that led people to vote for Trump? Some sort of contradictory impulses?
Sure. I mean, the reason I focus on economics is not that I'm an economist. I'm an economist because I became fascinated by the economic dimension of things. So I would like to say that it's not, the old joke, if you're a carpenter, then everything looks like a nail. It's not that. It's that the economics, and I can tell you just for myself, as I went through, when I arrived as a freshman in college, I wanted to be a biochemist. That was my intention. I had been a science kind of person in high school, and I wanted to be, and my first semester was all math, physics, chemistry, second semester biology. So here I am an economist. I obviously didn't do that. I didn't make that my career. And that's because I discovered that the questions I had about the economic system, which came out of my life, my family, my conversation, particularly with my father, and so on, and that those questions were never answered by the teachers, that I would say. And I think I mentioned this to you before, that those teachers either didn't know the answer, which was often the case, or they did, and either told me, rarely, or showed me more often that they really didn't want me to pursue this in the class with my hand up. I was a good student. I got all A's and blah, blah. My parents made sure of that. So I had, the teachers were friendly to me. There wasn't oppositional. A couple of exceptions, but not many. They were afraid. And I think the fear in their eyes, which I pursued by going to their offices and just sitting one-on-one with them, where they told me what they were. I realized I was right. I saw fear. And they told me, that they were afraid. They didn't want this. They wouldn't mind talking with me in their office. And then they basically explained to me, what I verified later anyway, that, and this is Harvard, so you might think it wasn't. You'd be wrong. It was not good for your career. They were concerned. They don't know how a conversation in which I ask questions dealing with Marxism and they answer them would lead students to begin to say, well, I'm not teaching, without meaning the teacher any harm, but the students would chit-chat and all that. And they were afraid. And I think my interest combined with their unwillingness or incapacity to answer them drew me into the field. So if you ask me, why do I focus on economics? Because the environment in which I was educated couldn't handle it. It was a taboo, It's like saying to someone, why are you interested in sex? If they're honest, they'll tell you, whatever the manifold reasons might be. One of the reasons is a big taboo. And when they ask questions, Aunt Louise freaked out, or their father told them to go talk to the mother, and vice versa. We all know this, and that's part of why we're interested in sex, because it has been handled in the bizarre ways that our culture does that. I'm interested in economics because I think it helps explain things, but much more important, it's the missing thing in the explanations. Otherwise, we're stuck with work at the level of your representation. I don't want to hold Mr. Hanson, but the way you represented it, which I assume is the perfectly reasonable way of doing it, that I don't want to work at that level. That's for me, that's not serious stuff. And by the way, Tucker Carlson sometimes really goes after the economics. And you can see that even today. What did I see today? Oh, yeah. Coming here in the taxi, there was a little ad, a political ad, the slogan was, bust big pharma. Okay. I found that interesting. I am agreeing with, I would like to bust big pharma too, but I'm surprised that somebody raised the money to do this sort of thing. Okay, that's sort of interesting. And I have noticed in some right-wing pieces I've read an immense hostility to big pharma, a hostility which the right wing didn't used to do, but it's doing it now.
Yeah.
What's that? That's an allowable area. Yet, to watch the inauguration of Mr. Trump and to see immediately in the front row the people sitting behind him, the billionaires of our time, not the governors, not the Supreme Court justice, who is the celebrate? And their achievement is they have a lot of money. And they're going to be with this president. He wants them there. That's why they're there. They want to be there, and he wants them there. This is very interesting. And so he can go after Big Pharma. They don't stop him. They carefully avoid going there. But Big Pharma is not that far from big high tech, which is what's coming next anyway. And we'll see how Mr. Trump deals with it.
Since economics has, naturally it keeps coming up. The last thing I wanted to ask about this election specifically is whether you also account, beyond this large-scale change narrative, for the outcome of the election with an appeal to economic factors? Like, I know inflation, for instance, plagued Biden for a very long time, but are there other economic factors that you think really contributed to Trump's victory?
Oh, sure. My goodness. Yeah. I don't even think inflation played a role, but it shouldn't be yanked out of the context of everything else. The job prospects for millions of young people in this country are awful. There aren't jobs. I mean, even in my field, my students, I sit on doctoral committees, and I have to examine a student, and I have to make a decision whether he or she gets their PhD or not, whether this dissertation is acceptable. The students it's harder and harder for them to get decent jobs. If I had time, I'd give you a lecture, but the catastrophe of higher education in this country. When I went to graduate school, I never questioned. Of course I'd get a job being a professor. That's what people with PhDs from fancy universities could get if they wanted it. I might not get the job of my dreams, be professor at this school, or sure, but that I would have a problem having an income, and it never dawned on me. And that's not because of me. It didn't dawn on my fellow students either. We never talked about it. We never worried about it. No, not at all. Zero. My students obsess about it. That's a radical difference. And most of my students cannot get the kind of job I have. All of my adult life, I taught 2 courses a semester, 2 semesters a year, and got paid a salary that I could have a wife, which I had, and 2 children, which I had, still have, and I never thought about it. And I enjoy good food and wine. I like to travel. I have tastes that cost money, and I always had enough. I'm not super rich, but that's all gone. My students worry how they'll live in terms of income, what kind of work they will be able to get. Many of them are adjunct professors who teach a course over here, then they run across town teaching. There's no time to write. There's no time to do research. There's barely enough time to kind of keep up with, which, by the way, is a diminution of our education system. Serious. It means large numbers of young people are being educated by folks that are exhausted. I wasn't exhausted. I had time to read and prepare my lectures. Very precious to me. I learned, as any teacher who's honest will tell you, you learn much more when you're a teacher than you ever did when you were a student. I had that opportunity. Most of the people like me don't have that opportunity anymore. So that's a very serious problem. It's only for 2 or 3 million people that are the folks who teach in colleges and universities. But that's not an unimportant part of the economy. I would argue it's spectacularly important. I don't know if you're aware or if your audience is, but we have more and more colleges and universities that are closing every month. Why? Because their economics is impossible, right? They can't get the students because the students are increasingly unwilling to load up with the debt without which you can't go to college anymore. Wasn't my case. Most of my fellow students didn't. I did. I had to borrow because my family had no money. But most of the students around me didn't. Their families had enough money to pay. Mine didn't, but I never worried about it. I didn't have to borrow that much, and I knew I would have a job which would allow me to pay off my debt, which is exactly what happened to me. I expected it. I got it. That's all gone now. That's all gone. China is opening a new university once a month.
Wow. That's a big stark difference.
Yeah, a very stark difference. And you want to know, I don't know if you know the DeepSeek story. That's a little entrepreneur.
Could you tell it? Yeah, for our
Sure. DeepSeek has come up with a better way of moving the artificial intelligence revolution forward. And it exploded into the public awareness in the middle of January, the second half of January of this year, 2025. And the breakthrough came in a small company owned and started by an entrepreneur who's the CEO of the little company called DeepSeek, with the S capitalized. So it's the word deep and then capital Seek. And he explains that he hired new graduates of some of the new technical universities in China. He doesn't say, but clearly the message is they're fresh, they're new, and they're cheap. Because one of the things that he came up with was a competitor product. Basically, think of it as a search engine for how to go through vast amounts of data super quick to come up with what AI can do, which is a paragraph or a paper or an analysis. It's crude, but it does a lot of the preliminary research that anybody has to do in any field. It's being used now, for example, to do diagnosis. You feed into this machine the 27 characteristics of a patient who comes with a pain or something, and you get better diagnoses because basically you can mine the history of those symptoms and see when they all occur together what the three most likely diseases, and that just saves an enormous amount. Very helpful, and they have comparable applications in many other fields. I use it myself. I've begun to use it recently.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you can have an idea of a relationship in economics between, I don't know, an interest rate and exports. And you say, what is the relationship between it? And the machine gives you an answer. Now, there are holes in it, there are mistakes in it, but it gives you a very nice place to start. Then you fix the holes and you correct the errors. It's as if you had a very good graduate student and said, go get me everything on this, which is what, I mean, I've been in that position. I told the graduate, go get me this. Right? And you very quickly discover who's the better graduate student, who isn't, because one of them comes back in 2 days with a wonderful, and the other one comes back in 2 days and says, how do I do this?
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's a small company, and for a tiny fraction, I believe $5 or $6 million, they have done something that is the equivalent of what costs billions in Silicon Valley. And, the stock market, the biggest company in the United States in the stock market recently was a company called NVIDIA. You may have heard of it. It lost $600 billion. Let me do it again. $600 billion of value.
Oh, gosh.
In one day.
Wow.
When this was publicized, it turned out the publicity was that over the last weekend, it really was this last weekend, more people downloaded that program, which, by the way, is available for free from this little company, than anything else on the whole Apple system. Apple app, they bought it from the App Store, So everyone in America, I now know 20 people that are using it. That's how fast all these things go. They're not using the ones from California. They're using that one. Because for them, I mean, California is still producing these things, and there will be company. It's not over. The one in China has flaws also. It's not that. It's just another sign, if you needed it, where the competition is coming. And since that's the remaining dynamic industry of the United States, to see it there, wow. Before, and I will be using that example now to make my argument, before, and I believe the last time you and I spoke, the example was electric vehicles. That was where the Chinese, but that's an old industry, the automobile industry. AI is the newest of the new explosive industries, and the Chinese are right there, neck and neck, doing it. I mean, it's just, and then when you hear he's taking advantage of all the universities opening up, I think the American economy is in terrible difficulty, and that the crisis of our time, which includes Mr. Trump, is that the response is denial, self-delusional denial, which is not surprising. I have a certain compassion for it. It's hard to be alive at a time when your empire is dying. It's hard if your economic system is full of problems. It really is.
That conversation we had about the electric vehicles was a couple of episodes ago, and we're reaching a lot of new listeners now. And on top of that, I found that whole story incredibly fascinating because we think of the automobile as an American invention, if there ever was one, and we think of ourselves as being on the cutting edge of their development, even now with electric vehicles and Tesla. So for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with this story, just are we not dominating electric vehicles anymore? What's going on?
I'll be happy to do it. But the most important thing about it is that interested, intelligent, thoughtful people like your audience and like you don't know it. That ought to worry you. Okay, here it is. 15 years ago, the automobile industry began a competition. Who could come up with the best electric vehicle? Because it was understood and generally viewed that's the future of the automobile industry. We are in a transition for ecological reasons and cost reasons, blah, blah, blah. We're moving away from fossil fuels that make our cars run, gasoline, and we're going to go to electric. Okay. That was a consensus. Why? Because there were very few voices, but very few voices, which were drowned out in the United States, pushed aside, the way these folks usually are, which said that this was fundamentally irrational, that what the country needs is mass transit. Why? Because the individual vehicle is a ridiculous way of organizing transportation. Most cars spend most of every day sitting somewhere. This is nuts. What are you doing? Yeah, it's in your garage, it's in the street, it's in the parking facility. What are you doing? So that for 20 minutes a day, or maybe even an hour a day, you're actually in there. But the rest of the time sits there. What? You can even see the understanding carefully that we now have bicycles here in New York City. Loads of them all over. Every few blocks there's a bunch of, and when you need a bicycle, you get a bicycle. You pull it out, it's automated, you drive around and you stick it back in one of the holders, and that way a terribly amount of waste is avoided. We're not building millions of bicycles because we don't need millions. Millions of people want a bicycle, we'll provide it. 20,000 will do it very nicely because I'll take it for the hour I need it and put it back in, and John will come, and then Mary will come, and we'll share. We have a mass transit system for bicycles, just like we have here in New York City, a subway with a fantastic invention. It takes many more people at an infinitely lower cost. Nobody gets injured or once in a blue moon by a subway. No, it's just, it doesn't pollute. It's infinitely better to do mass transit. Do it beautifully. Do it elegantly. People say to me, well, what would that mean? I say, go to Europe to get on a train. Go to Tokyo. I'm familiar with Europe. The trains are magnificent. You have even the super fast ones, Why the United States is so far behind, we'll leave aside, although fascinating. Anyway, 15 years ago, we're going to do the electric car. Stupid, because you're replacing the private car with another private car, but at least better than fossil fuel, it'll be electricity run. Okay, Tesla is one of the early pioneers and makes Mr. Elon Musk a household name and rich, very rich. But General Motors works on it, Ford works on it, Toyota works on it, everybody works on it. But here we are now, 15 years later. The Chinese have automobile companies. They work on it too. But they win. They win the competition. The best car, best electric car and truck, at the lowest price, is made by the BYD Corporation, precisely unknown in the United States for a simple reason. They're not permitted to come here. If you go to Europe today and you go on the highways, you'll see BYD vehicles all over the place. Why? Mr. Biden, first Mr. Trump put a 27% tariff on electric vehicles from China. And then Mr. Biden, while he was still president, raised it to 100%. So if you want to get a BYD electric car, say it costs $30,000. If you're an American company or an American individual, you would have to come up with $30,000 that goes to China to buy the car. And then 100%, another $30,000 that goes to Uncle Sam as a tariff, costing you $60,000. What does this mean? It means that Americans won't buy the Chinese car because it's $60,000, and they can get for $45,000 or $50,000 a Tesla or a GM. This is a tariff that protects Tesla and GM. That's why it's there. But it denies to the American people access to the best electric vehicle at the lowest price. And now let me explain very briefly why that is stupid. Okay? American companies compete with companies in the rest of the world. American companies that make shoes, if there are any left, American companies that make anything. They need trucks, for example. They need a truck to bring the inputs to wherever they carry out production, and they need trucks to take the output to wherever it's sold, right? So trucks are widely used input here in America by American companies and everywhere else in the world. But everywhere else in the world is now going to be able to get the best quality electric truck for $30,000. Whereas their American competitor could only get the best electric truck if they paid $60,000, which they won't. They'll buy an inferior truck and still pay more than their competitor pays for the superior truck. And you know what that means? American companies are going to lose the competition and eventually lay off the workers since they can't sell their products that have been too expensively produced. So you're protecting the workers at GM and Ford, but at the expense of not only many other American workers, but I can tell you as a mathematical economist, we cannot know whether the jobs we protect in the automobile industry won't be overwhelmed by the jobs we lose as a result of this tariff. Okay, we live in a society, which I may jump ahead in our conversation, in which we allow a president to do Mr. Trump, to do remarkable things. One, to constantly misspeak about tariffs. By now it's intentional, because we're going to hit the Chinese. Chinese people don't pay our tariffs. We do. The tariff is a tax on imports. All right? That means the Republican Party, for 100 years, the party advocating tax cuts, has become overnight a party championing taxes, namely tariffs. That already ought to make people go, what's going on here? But he slides out from that by having large numbers of Americans, all the polls show it, think that the tariff is paid by the people over there, not America. It isn't. No, it is real simple. It isn't. But number two, he never tells you what are the, how do I put this? What are the negatives? What are the side effects of a tariff? Now, tariffs have been around for centuries. There is an immense literature in economics about tariffs. There's nothing new about it. There's nothing unheard of. If you take a course in international trade, in any economics program that I'm familiar with, and I'm familiar with a lot of them, I've taught this material. You teach it. There's a segment of the course about tariffs. And what you do is you teach, when are tariffs used? What do they achieve? What are the problems? What are the negative and positive, and they're both, side effects? But we have a president who talks about this is a win-win-win-win situation. This is moronic. It doesn't understand the literature, which never says that. It doesn't understand even what it is doing. And it's a continual fooling of the people into thinking that, we're going to reshore, bring industry back because we're going to make it too expensive for them to. Yes, there'll be some of that, but there'll be all these other things which the literature is full of, because these are lessons that have been learned by people who did this. All of this is magicked away. It's a stunning, that Mr. Trump, he doesn't understand it. It's clear to me, because if he did, the level of lying, maybe he's capable of it, but I'll give him the benefit that I find that hard to understand. But that the New York Times and the others, Paul Krugman writes for the New York Times. He's a Nobel and his specialty is international trade. He knows. Come on. And many like him know. But there's this America, and that's, again, the legacy of the Cold War. You don't. Even this weird Trump character, because these are often liberals that don't like him, they can't bring themselves to be reasonably critical. That may change, but for the moment, I'm here explaining the economics of tariffs to people. I do it all the time because they ask all the time, and you should see them in the audiences. They're all. That's because I'm telling them something that they don't know, and that's not their fault. That should be. What are you doing, mister? Why are you doing a tariff when you know that, yes, you will protect the jobs of the immediately affected, but there are all these other consequences? What? It's like announcing I'm taking over the Panama Canal. You can't do that because of the ramifications. What are you? You've been denouncing Mr. Putin for 3 years, that he invaded another country and took something that isn't his. You just announced you're going to do that. What? What do you think that has? You don't have to worry. You just met a tough guy. Stop. This isn't serious. But with him, this exaggerated bluster got him the election because it's the naughty boy. And he's being naughty again. And the whole world is more naughty. And it works. But man, those negative side effects, they don't go away because you pretend they're not there. That's like the little child, and I did this with you, I'm sure. The little 3-year-old confronts the scary doggy in the park, and he or she puts their little hands in front of their eyes because they think if they can't see the dog, it won't be there. But by the time they're 4 or 5 years old, they have learned the lesson. You can do that. The doggy's still there. Mr. Trump and this country are engaged in levels of denial that I look at and I go, wow, what is going on in a society that would do this? Why self-delude? What possible? And if we, as I believe, well, I hope we do, talk about the internal contradictions of the economic program of Mr. Trump, then you'll see that this is what I've just told you is all over the place. Not just with tariffs, but with deporting immigrants and so on. You know, the secondary consequences here ought to make any rational government stop. And the fact that this government isn't stopping, well, draw the conclusion. Let me try to illustrate the contradictions, internal craziness of what is being proposed. And I'm going to do that in two ways. I'm going to use what we in economics call supply and demand analysis, a very simple-minded approach we teach students as a beginning to understanding economics. And then I'm going to also use the Marxian economics idea of surplus, which gives you insights that the supply and demand apparatus doesn't. Okay. The president says, and has already in the first weeks of his administration, illustrated dramatically that he is going to deport undocumented immigrants, of which the Homeland Security Department of this country says we have somewhere around 12 million, 10 to 15 million, somewhere in there. Okay, let's take a look at what this might mean. Mostly these are undocumented immigrants, are young people of working age. Yes, some of them bring children when they come, but most don't. And some of them bring their elderly, but most don't. These are young men and women who can travel through the desert and take the hardships that are involved in coming here for many. So they arrive here and they take the worst jobs. And by worst jobs, I don't just mean those that are poorly paid, although that's the majority of them. I mean jobs that are dangerous, jobs that are irregular, jobs for employers that are highly unscrupulous much of the time. And the reason they have those jobs is because, unlike a native-born worker, they will never go to the police to complain if they're made to work without protective gear, or they're made to work too many hours, or they're made to work without being given the pay that they were promised when they undertook the job. Employers know that they can get away with this because they've been doing that forever, for time immemorial, which means that the immigrant is particularly profitable as an employee because you can rip them off, basically. And that's one of the reasons that the United States has always welcomed employees, because the employers knew you could do things with them you couldn't otherwise. I could go on. You also cram these people into the worst neighborhoods with the lousiest housing, again, because they cannot and will not complain. They will not demand what is legally available to them for fear that it will blow their cover and they will be hassled by the police. The police don't treat them very well, again, for the same reasons, and so on. So I'm not going to mention what it means to target these people, many of whom have spent years at the bottom of the jobs pyramid in the United States. What it means exactly, ethically or morally, to pick them up off the street, put them in shackles, which is being done now, and dropping them in Mexico or Colombia or wherever you can, impose that. How this squares with Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or any other religious system I know of, I leave to the mysteries of how human beings are religious, extraordinary. But I'm not going to focus on that. Here's the supply and demand. You are reducing the supply of labor. You're literally taking people who had offered and delivered labor effort, brains and muscles, 8 hours a day or more, across the United States. Millions of them are being withdrawn from the labor market. So the supply of workers is being cut. You know, if you're going to get rid of 10 million people, it's going to make an impact. On the other hand, you're going to impose tariffs, meaning that goods produced abroad will no longer be purchased by Americans because they become more expensive. Mr. Trump has said, and by the time this airs, he may well have imposed 25% tariffs on both Canadian and Mexican goods. And again, I'm not going to, that's what he said. And he had promised to do that earlier, so they're consistent. That violates the treaties that were initially signed by Mr. Clinton, the NAFTA, and then rewritten and re-signed by Trump himself in his first presidency with a new name. But it's basically a common market between the United States, Canada to the north, Mexico to the south. And it meant that goods could move between them without tax, no tax being applied by any of the three countries to any of the other. He's abrogating that. He's not having a conference to discuss it. He's not having meetings with the leadership to talk. Unilaterally abrogating, which is the politest way you can put this, violating would be another term, this treaty with our two neighbors. Interesting move.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to assume it goes through in one form or another. The United States is the major market for both of those countries. Therefore, this is a big blow to them because they're going to see the demand for their exports to the United States drop because an American has to pay his own government, the American government, the tariff, the tax, and that makes it more expensive in the manner I just went through with the electric car from China. So it's going to hurt them. And Mr. Trump never discusses the hurt done to them, deals with them as if they're bad people, and says this is all done because they allow fentanyl to come through their countries into the United States. Notice, the bad guy is the one who allows the movement, not the country to which the movement is directed, because Americans buy and consume that stuff at a record level. Nope, none of that. Interesting. No, Mr. Trump says it's also, he admits, to reshore America, right? Because if it's too expensive to bring the object from Canada in or from Mexico in, the hope is that the producer will come back to the United States, make it inside, because then there's no tariff. It's applicable. All right. I'm not going to discuss the obvious, and I'm glad you're smiling because it really is childishly obvious that a producer in Canada or Mexico would be nuts to come here right away because he doesn't know how long Mr. Trump will stay with this policy. He doesn't know whether it'll disappear when Mr. Trump disappears. And it's very expensive. So, we also don't know whether the company affected like this will leave Mexico and go across its southern border into Guatemala or another place, which doesn't have a tariff. But then it can't risk doing that because Mr. Trump will put the tariff on against the Guatemalan goods. So let's assume that some reshoring takes place. Some companies at the margin will come in to the United States and produce here at home, the ostensible goal and purpose of all of this. That would mean an increase in the demand for labor, because those companies, instead of hiring Mexican and Canadian workers, by coming back, would be hiring American workers, which is the ostensible purpose. Okay, the supply of labor is going down, and the demand for labor is going up. What is that supposed to do with demand and supply analysis? Answer: it's going to raise wages a lot. Why? Because you can't rip off American-born workers the way you ripped them. So you're going to have to pay wages you never thought you'd have to. So wages will go up in the United States. Whoa. Now let's take it 2 more steps and we're done. Why would capitalists across America who supported Mr. Trump welcome that the cost of labor is going up and eating into their profits?
Seems like a contradiction.
But we're not done. Because when Mr. Trump imposes a tariff, one of the results, the textbooks are full of this, is called retaliation. Other countries can put tariffs just like we can, which means American companies who export are going to have the same problem. They're not going to have a market the way they used to because the countries retaliate. They put a tariff on goods from America, and they've said it. If you tariff us, we will retaliate. So the companies will have higher wages to pay while they can't sell the way they used to. That's a 1-2 punch right in the nose of the employer class. They're the ones who gave him the job. That's not his job in their minds. How's he going to handle what I just described? What? Not only that, but if you put a tariff and the prices go up, what the literature teaches is that the protected companies, the ones who like it that you put a tariffs so that your Canadian competitor can't compete with you anymore and your Mexican competitor can't, what you induce the Americans say, great, I can raise my prices. Because even if I raise them 10%, they've stuck the Canadians with 25% tariff. Everyone's going to have to pay me my 10% more because it's still better than the alternative they can get. You know what that means? You're going to get an inflation. Is it possible that other things, which I don't have the time, but if you want to, we can go there, that other things will neutralize what I just said? That's possible. That's what I meant by a Hail Mary pass. What he's doing is ridiculous economically. And so maybe his rejoinder, or someone who's smarter than him might be able to do, is to say, yes, but if this, and this happen, well, that's possible. It's always possible. But it's not the logical thing to expect. And to expect it from someone who never mentions any of these things, even though, as I hope I've showed you, they're as simple as apple pie. There are no mystery here. There's nothing complicated. And the literature about these things is full of all of this. Not a word of what I just said to you is original to me. Not at all. So all I can tell you is, with this level of contradiction at the basis of what is being proposed here, you're looking at a really strange phenomena unfolding. Now let me show you from a Marxian economics perspective, another remarkable thing, which also touches American history and which I'm really interested in conveying to your audience. A working age immigrant, which is what most of the undocumented immigrants in the United States today are, is a gift to the United States. It is a subsidy to the United States. It is very weird to be ejecting this gift. It really is like a neighbor bringing you a lovely apple pie, and while they're there, you're saying, "Oh, thank you," and then you throw it in the garbage. I mean, whoa, that's bizarre. What are you doing? Right? Why do I say that? Well, take a 20-year-old Guatemalan young woman comes across the border. An enormous amount of money has been spent on that 20-year-old young woman before she crosses the border in Texas and enters the United States as an undocumented immigrant. She has had to be fed for 20 years. That costs money. She's had to be clothed for 20 years. That costs money. She's had to be sheltered. She had to be educated to a certain amount, whatever they have where she comes from. Those are enormous expenses. Every society has such expenses for the citizens before they reach working age. Think of it this way. When they work, they produce, they create value. Until they work, they absorb it. That's what we do for our children. Guatemala picked up the cost. The United States had no cost. We didn't feed them. We didn't raise them. Nothing. The Guatemalans did that for free from the American point of view. Not from them. They had a real expenditure. They had to produce the food, clothing, and shelter that they gave to their children. We didn't, we get them only when they're ready to work. Now, in Marxian theory, when they work, let's assume they're paid $10 an hour. Maybe I should assume $7.25, because that's the minimum wage in this country, the federal minimum wage. They get paid $7.25 per hour. It's clear and easy to show that for most of them, in an hour, they produce by their labor either a greater quantity or a better quality of an output, whatever they're hired to do. You know, fold laundry, wash your car, whatever. Which means, now I'm using the Marxian system, they produce a surplus. Mm-hmm. No one is going to hire them for $7.25 unless doing so makes the employer more than $7. That's the rationale. Marx worked this out, so I have to give him credit. Otherwise, I would be acting as though I had figured this out, which I didn't. So the immigrant brings to the United States a costless worker who immediately goes to work. How else are they going to survive? Producing a surplus for the employer who hires him. A better surplus, proportionally, than he could get from a native-born worker, which is why he hired him. Okay. This is an enormous gain to the United States economy. Not a loss, a gain. Dwarfs all the rest of the BS. Right? Does this worker get drunk sometime? Absolutely. Do they occasionally commit a crime? Of course. FBI tells us they commit crimes less than native-born, which I'm not surprised, because they're undocumented and they can't risk it. So this is a subsidy. Here comes the history. The United States' greatness as a capitalist system over the last century was dependent upon its ability to absorb wave after wave of the subsidy to this economy represented by immigrants. Deporting them is a sign of weakness. Deporting them means you can't get the subsidy. It's the equivalent of having high tech get billions of subsidy from Washington and saying, oh, no thanks, don't want it. Whoa, never going to happen. No company would be so stupid. And we're not stupid, so what's going on? We can't. We can't do anymore what we once did. What we once did was to say to the immigrant, come here. Yeah, we'll give you the crappiest jobs. Yeah, we'll stick you in the ghetto slum neighborhoods. Yeah. But within a reasonable amount of time, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, we'll be bringing in another wave, and they will be slipped in under you, and you will be able to rise. The crappiest jobs will now be given to them, the new immigrants. You will be able to go to the next level, a nicer neighborhood, a better school, better apartment, and all of it. And not only that, we'll make a mythology about it. It'll be called American exceptionalism, and it will focus on the remarkable social mobility that can be achieved. Horatio Alger, from poor immigrants, you will write all of that theater. We can't do it anymore. We can't. We're going to have to persuade Americans, native born, to live in the crappy housing, to accept the crappy job. No more Horatio Alger mythology. And you know what that's about? That's the weakness of American capitalism. That's the end of the empire and the profits it made. It's because the dollar isn't the universal currency anymore. It has to share that role with the Japanese yen or the Chinese yuan or the European euro. It's over. The empire's finished. But we can't say it. We can't face it. We can't talk about it as a nation. The president is acting like he's going to tell I'm taking Greenland, and I'm changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico. What childish theater this is. And so go back to the beginning of our conversation. That's why all this is irrelevant, because it's so detached from what is actually at stake here. It is so full of the bluster. I'm going to tariff this one. Europeans ask me, why the focus on the tariff? And I say to them, I want to do the whole analysis. I don't usually have the time. You give me the time, for which I am grateful. But the short answer to the Europeans is, when he was the president the first time, everything he tried to do was blocked by the Democrats or by lawsuits or by this. One of the few things he could just do is a tariff. Because Congress some years ago passed a law giving the president this odd power to use this tool unilaterally. He doesn't have to get anybody's permission. He can just do it, right? So he realized so the answer to why he's using tariffs is because he can. Not because it's the right tool, not because it's the best tool. It's because he can be Mr. Trump throwing thunderbolts like Zeus, in mythology. So that's why we're all talking about tariffs. We, as a culture, we don't know anything about it. The thing people are saying, if I were a nastier person, I would have a field day just mocking the officials who keep talking about tariffs, starting with Mr. Trump, because it's all the behavior of someone, the speech of someone who doesn't know what they're talking. It's not even, I don't blame him. He doesn't know anything. He shouldn't speak about what you don't know, because it's gonna come back and haunt you, and it will. It will. The Canadians are now going to have to react, and the Mexicans react. And I haven't even gone into that with you. Mexico, let's do that. Just one more. Mexico. We are going to deport, mostly to Mexico, Latino undocumented immigrants, which is the largest group. And most of those will go to Mexico. Okay. Let's do the simple economics. Those people had jobs here in the United States. And one of the things they did with their wages, low as they are, was to send a portion back to their families in Mexico to help care for the children they left behind, to help care for the elderly they left behind. Those things are called remittances in economics. But when you have millions of people, then they become an important part of your economy. Many of the villages of Mexico will be seriously impacted by the end of the remittances, which will happen when that immigrant who sent them is deported. He won't be working anymore, or she won't, and won't be able to send home. That's going to hurt the Mexican economy, number one. Now, number two, a tariff. Much of the industry in Mexico sells to the United States. They're going to suffer terribly by the closing of the American market, because Americans are not going to pay those tariffs to get those mixes. By the way, this includes basic things like home appliances, automobiles. Large numbers of automobiles in America, Ford, General Motors, come from Mexico, where they are produced or assembled. So Mexican industry is going to be hurt in its exports to the United States. And so they're going to have to lay off Mexican workers, which will increase unemployment. And now the last part. But the returning deportees will make that unemployment that much worse. Remittances stop. Exports hurt. And a flood of people with no jobs. Mexico is a poor country. This is impossible. You're going to create... You think you have a problem with the drug gangs of Mexico now? You're going to produce... I don't know, maybe Mr. Trump's hidden agenda is to annex all of Mexico and make it the 52nd state after he takes Canada. But maybe, look, and maybe he'll be forced into that by the very consequences of what he's doing. He is savaging Mexico. And we have, I don't know, 1,000-mile border with Mexico. Is that a very smart thing to do? Most people wouldn't think so. Where's the conversation? There is none. There is none. The closest you get are the statements of Mrs. Sheinbaum, the new leader of Mexico, who's got some courage and is pushing back. The Canadians folded, but not the Mexicans, so we'll see. But talk about contradictions. I hope I've given you a flavor of some of them.
A recurring idea in the conversation at this point is that Trump is the naughty boy. And as I think I've brought this up in many of our past conversations because it's impossible to avoid, that you are probably the most gifted rhetorician and natural thespian, since you mentioned theater, that I've met in my life. And this is a skill set that both of you, the two of you, have in common. And
maybe that's why I see it in him,
Yeah.
It's visible in everyone but yourself.
Yeah, that's funny. And Victor Davis Hanson, enter again, as long as we're using theater parlance. And we spoke about some of Trump's rhetorical tactics. And maybe he would be okay with the phrase naughty boy, but he thinks of Trump's rhetoric as extremely skillful and useful, and he appealed to the art of the deal and made cases for why some of these moves you've discussed were extremely useful. And I think these are still very topical talking points, and they're funny and interesting. So since you've mentioned them, I'd like to go through them one by one.
Okay.
First, what is the motivation behind or idea behind suggesting that we should make Canada the 51st state. Why would Trump say that? Is it useful? Was it skillful? Did it produce anything?
No, I don't think so. For me, I don't see any, again, and I would be interested in someone like Mr. Hanson, if he could, show me why that is a skillful strategic move. I don't see it. I see this as bluster, that Mr. Trump has discovered that this bluster is effective. And I think there's a psychological reason. I think he speaks for an awful lot of people who are frustrated, Americans I'm talking about, frustrated, bitter, angry, and yet don't have the time, the energy, the interest, the education to do very much with their anger. So they bluster too, over one too many beers. These Canadians, they are whatever. It normally it wouldn't be taken as much, but when he blusters, it validates their bluster, and that's his function. I think that's what he's doing. And he may be aware of it. I don't know if he's aware of it. My guess is he is. You remember early on in his career, he liked to say, I could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and people would still applaud what I'm doing. He stumbled onto a connection. His own life and that of large numbers of people. They vibrated together. He was dismissed by the upper echelons of American corporate society. He was, a gifted child. That is, the father left a lot of money to the kid, his father, who had real estate in Brooklyn, and left a chunk of money to his son. So the claim that he worked hard to make his money is silly, and that was used against him a lot. He suffered from that. He's none too bright, and so he didn't do very well in school, or he is bright and he spent time grabbing parts of anatomy and drinking too much, and so there wasn't much there. He got out of the army by his bone spurs and doesn't look very good. And the ruling elites didn't. His crudeness, he didn't learn at the university what so many people do, how to act. I had to learn that it was important to get a tweed jacket when I went to college. It was important to get a tweed jacket with a leather patch over here, whether I needed it or not. I learned how to speak. If you think I speak well, I did. I learned how to. My parents are immigrants. They were not adepts at the English language. I didn't speak English until I was 5. I spoke German and French. But I did learn a certain way of acting, a certain way of presenting myself. I don't think he ever did. He was naughty in various ways as he grew up, and was therefore an outsider and bitter about it, not able to break in, and associate. His daughter marries the son of another real estate dealer who's in jail. This is not, what is this? This is very strange. So I think he's belligerently angry at an establishment that excluded him. And that gives him a solidarity with masses of Americans who are also belligerently angry at another establishment that they feel rejects them. And they get a lot of that. And I don't deny that for a minute. There are an awful lot of people who, like Mr. Hanson, live in the world of the elites, and they feel one group is problematic because they think they are the elites, and the other group is problematic because they think they're oppressed by an elite. I disagree with the analysis out of which both positions come. I have no idea what elite means. If you're talking in the generalities, it's usually presented. I don't know what it means. People in California and New York work in different industries, have different communities, and see the world somewhat differently than if you live in Arkansas or Tennessee. I get that. Has always been true in this country. I don't, recasting it as, that's a game. I understand why you play it. I understand the purpose of it. I don't like it because I know where it can go. Well, it may not go there. I hope not, but I know where that can go. That's a little bit for me like listening to someone explain Larry Summers. Remember him?
He's been on the show.
Okay. He got himself into a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
When he was the president of Harvard. Gave a speech where he explained why women can't do science as well as men. Now, in my humble opinion, that's real stupid. Since I don't admire him, I don't mind saying that's real stupid. But it lost him that position. It hurt him badly. But the interesting question for him, where would this come? What are you doing? Even if you believe that, what are you doing? Talking like that. Don't you you don't know enough about American culture to know that at this day and age, in this society, you can't do that. Right? I mean, it says something about you, that you are way out of touch with the environment. It's astounding that is the qualification to be bounced out of Harvard. Not because you don't do economics, not because you can't run Harvard, and of course you can. But this is a level of some word, insensitivity, obtuseness, out of touchedness, that really disqualify me. Whoa. By the way, he said other things you could also, maybe you know them, go after him about. Now it's possible, I don't know him personally, but it's possible he's naughty too. That there's a part of him that wants to be able to say such a thing, and it leaked out. He maybe wasn't all that careful. I don't know. I don't even know what he thinks about it in retrospect. But it's another example of, wow. And his mistake, unlike Trump's, Trump discovered the audience that responded positively. Poor Larry didn't. He delivered that dumbness to the wrong audience, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. And he got punished for it. Mr. Trump, had he tried that bluster up at Harvard, would have been shot down, or Yale or any of the other places. No, he understood where he goes. Look where he is now. His base is the South, parts of the Midwest, and those kinds of folks around elsewhere. But he learned who his supporters were, and he went there. Earlier he didn't understand that. He was a playboy in New York. His excitement was going to the Playboy Club. His excitement was being a junior member of the rich in New York City. He hated being junior all the time, which I get. And the naughtiness was encouraged by that. So he was angry about being excluded, and then was naughty, which assured his exclusion. And he was trapped in that contradiction without the ability, I don't know if he can spell contradiction, let alone use it analytically, but as one of the senators, whose name I forget, once said, there is no intelligence requirement to be a senator.
Yeah, it's a good one. Well, the the second of these rhetorical topics that I wanted to address, you've already mentioned, but I think it might also be a good opportunity as a throwback to some of our earlier, more pedagogically focused episodes for a bit of an economics or a trade lesson. But what is the strategic importance of the Panama Canal for us? And why would Trump make the hint, well, they're not hints, the claims about taking it as he has been?
Well, I'll give you the answer, but I'm not at all sure that the answer I'm giving you is why Mr. Trump did this. And I'm genuinely concerned not to be misunderstood on that point. I can make a better case for what he did than he has so far made.
Okay, interesting.
Here's my suspicion why he did it. Because it is a way of being naughty and tough. Jimmy Carter, I believe, in 1977, signed the documents that gave the canal to the sovereign independent country of Panama. Okay? So it violates. So he's naughty. He's violating the rules. He's the rule breaker, the new rule maker. Most Americans had no idea that there's an issue there. Number one.
What is the big issue there?
The only issue that I can see is part of an anti-China agenda. The number one country that uses the Panama Canal is the United States. The number two country is China. Because they're number one and two in a whole lot of areas. There's 1, 2. China has built, not surprisingly, a bunch of port facilities on either end of the canal. Buildings, and bought land and have establishments there. Chinese companies and who may or may not be part of the Chinese government. So American companies began some years ago to be a little bit worried about what is going on in these Chinese companies, which comes out of a fantasy, that's what I think it is, that the Chinese are aggressively moving into position to cause difficulties for the United States. I don't think that's true. I do think that the American empire is declining and that the Chinese either are going to be the next empire or, if we're lucky, will be the sponsor for a genuine multilateralism. We'll see. We don't know yet. I don't know yet, but I know no one else knows yet either. I do know that the United States everywhere is trying to stop, slow, constrain, and constrict China. The containment policy that they believe worked on Russia has now been adapted or extended to apply to China. That's why they held back the chips, which didn't succeed because of what happened with DeepSeek. All right? That's why they all of a sudden got interested in Taiwan again. That's why the Seventh Fleet is in South China Sea. So here the president can show he's doing something against China. Look, the problem is the United States' ability to slow down and stop China has so far proven to be zero. They can't do anything. I want to remind people who might question this, leading government spokesmen and women have been saying for at least 10 years, if not longer, that we need to put more we, the Americans, need to put more pressure to constrict and constrain China. Didn't use those words, but that's what it amounted to. Why? Because the expectation, this is sort of the official line, the expectation in the minds of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon when they went to China ended the refusal to recognize the government of China. Let's remember, the communists come to power in 1949, and Kissinger and Nixon go to China in 1970, early 70s. Okay, so, whoa, that's a long time. When you pretended they're not there, you would not send an ambassador, you would not receive an ambassador, all of that. What that meant was that the Japanese and the Europeans got to do productive and profitable trade with China. Americans were excluded. They didn't want that anymore, and so, okay, we'll open up. That was the real reason. Then the BS official was, this is going to help integrate China into the world economy, moving it closer to the liberal democracy that we have. It's hard for me to repeat this nonsense, but it's the official line. We were all supposed to wait for China to come around. When it came time to bring them into the World Trade Organization, which was necessary for the benefits to American companies of being able to deal with China, the same BS was recycled. By letting them into the World Trade, they would become more like us, which of course means freedom, democracy, apple pie, and baseball. Okay?
Good things.
Absolutely. Starting 10 or 15 years ago, it became clear, particularly to the kind of American politician who came to be known as a neocon, for good reason, began to realize that this strategy wasn't working, that it was enabling China to grow like blazes economically, but it wasn't becoming more like us at all. The Communist Party was still the controlling political element. It managed the state, and the state supervised a hybrid economy, one half private capitalist enterprise, one half government-owned enterprise, which is more or less the way it is now. And the neocons decided and used Clinton, Obama, and Biden to articulate. They persuaded them, so they became the Democratic center, championed by Clinton, that China was a net enemy. Bringing them into the world trade thing was too good for them, number one, and number two, wasn't doing, which, by the way, some of them were honest enough to say, regime change, a liberal democratic parliamentary system. And so it became necessary to constrain and constrict and limit and punish and hurt them. And because of the legacy of the Cold War, again, sitting down with the Chinese to try to say, look, you're a declining empire, we're a rise empire. We can come to blows over that. Lord knows human history gives us examples. Or we can try to find a way to share the planet. Let's at least try this sharing the planet. After all, the last quarter of the 20th century was a time when both the United States and China experienced pretty good economic growth together. The neocons smashed that. They didn't didn't want that kind of talk, then we have to, it's crystal clear, like with the Soviet Union. And remember, the Soviet Union conveniently implodes in 1989. So there's the success. It worked. Reagan was able to, we defeated them. Okay. So we have a plan how to do it. Do to the Chinese what we did to the Russians. It worked with the Russians. It should work. So they're very upset now. It didn't. It didn't. They didn't change anything. Now, of course, with half a brain, you might have said to yourself, China went from one of the poorest countries on earth in 1949 to a superpower, economically speaking, in 30 to 40 to 50 years. What incentive would there be for the government of a country that had that record to change itself? Are you crazy? That's their success. They're not give that up. What? It's crazy. It's a crazy thing to imagine that would happen. And it didn't happen. So they don't know that they made a mistake in their strategy. Americans can't do that. We made a mistake. No, never make a mistake. Like Mr. Trump, in that way he's not naughty. He always doubles down or tells us another story. But that's not unique to him. So the Panama Canal is a way to hit the Chinese. That's all. It says we may close it. We may not let you through. Now, could they do that anyway? Sure. What's the point? So here comes the theater. Holding back China is a complicated game because it's only half real. Because in the last 40 years, the Chinese not only grew, but the American dependency on China also grew for goods and services. Look, what you have to pay an American worker is much less than it would have been if you could not unload cheap Chinese consumer goods on everybody. Your pants, your shirt, your car, your toaster, your shaving equipment, it's all made in China, or was. Still, most of it is. That cheapens the cost of living for working class people, which allows you to pay them less money because they can still go to the mall and pick up at Walmart or Target all of that junk, which comes from China and which is distributed in America by Walmart and Target. The marriage made in heaven. Now, those two companies have to be very careful never to say that. But if you look at it, it's no secret. It's easy to show. Walmart and China walk hand in hand for the last 50 years. They need each other dreadfully. Walmart is against all these tariffs. It doesn't want to have to charge the people who go to Walmart more money because it knows who those people are and it knows what this all means. Now, that's true for Dollar General and dollar stores and all the rest of it. So American strategy is always split. You have to posture, punish, constrict, and constrain, but you have to also deal with the realities of it. And the Chinese know that. The Chinese are gambling. The time is on their side. They keep going. This year, I like to tell this to people because Americans don't know. I would say since Trump's election, even before, but since Trump's election, the chorus of articles in places like the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and so on, talking about the really great performance of the American economy is amazing to me. What are you talking? 2.8%? Maybe. That's the best of the various estimates. There are many quite lower. But 2.8%, the United States GDP grew in 2024, the year just ended. That's according to the IMF, which is a pro-Western institution. That's their number. They're as good or better than anybody else who does this kind of number. The same IMF says that this year In 2024, the growth in China, 5%, double. In India, 7%, triple. What? India and China are the two central players in something called the BRICS. The gap between the BRICS and the G7, that's the American equivalent, is therefore growing, as it has every one of the last 25 years. You're not in great shape if that gap is growing. You're not. Or at least, let's put it this way. It's very odd to talk about what a great shape you are and leave discussion of this out. Because from this angle, it ain't so great. But we live in a country where it was necessary. I want to remind you, I'm sure you noticed, but the whole last 2 years of the Biden administration, the following phenomena really irritated people. The economy, all the economics people were doing great. The president was doing great. But poll after poll of the American people said the economy is the number one problem we have. So there was article after article which went like this. Why are the American people misunderstanding the reality of the economy? And there were lots of advice to the Democrats. Be careful, you're going to get hurt in the election. You've got to make people understand just the idea that the economists might be looking at the wrong thing and the mass of people looking at something else, and that would explain why they had a different... No. Could not raise the most obvious. What? You had to make one side or the other stupid. So the mass of the people are ill-informed, inadequately. What are you doing? You have the greatest control over mass media of any society, and you have for a long time. If the masses don't get it, what's the matter with your system? You've gotten them to believe everything else you need. You can't get this. They couldn't break out of it. And it did hurt them in the election. But I'm here to tell you that the American economy is in terribly difficult conditions. And now the anxiety that he's provoking, this, particularly with I'm cutting back. I have a good friend, a woman who works in a shelter in New York City. Several hundred people live in this shelter. And they were going to close this coming August. She explained to me yesterday it has been moved up till March because the government money is drying up. And then they had a scare last week when he issued that order because some official in Washington told them they might have to close this next week, dumping several hundred people onto the streets of New York City.
At this time of year.
So they can join the others sleeping in the subway tunnels of New York City. And also, since a number of these people have fairly serious emotional or mental problems, who knows? New York, my wife will not go on the subway anymore. She's afraid. She's afraid of random physical violence, which particularly affects women. This a person who's not even about to steal, who just comes up and bashes you in the head with a brick or something because you remind them of their mother or their cousin or some bad moment in their lives or something. It's just, whoa. So I could give you endless statistics, but it's an economy in a lot of trouble. And here again, the notion of irrelevance. It's not that what he does has no impact. It does. But there's no link between a concerted strategic approach to a clearly defined logical target. That's why the naughty and the theatrics seem to be mostly what this is about. Poking liberals in the eye, being offensive in your language, being dramatic. I'm taking the canal. I want Greenland. Screw NATO. Screw Denmark. All of this. What's it for? He's not going to help the situation with any of those countries. Denmark, Europeans, I can assure you, are up in arms. That for them, they never heard of this. A member of NATO is basically taking the property of another member of NATO. The whole point of NATO was not to have this. They used to tell each other how they have to love each other and take care of each other because of the big Russian bear that's bearing down on them. What happened to the Russian bear? Why are you? And so the fear, this is a whole other conversation we ought to have. This is the end of Europe as a major player in the world economy. And that has not happened for centuries. And people not to understand that is going to be a traumatic feature of our lives in the years ahead are not understanding what's going on. The turmoil inside these countries, the loss of the war in Ukraine, the end of NATO, all of these things are happening, and meanwhile, Europe has no role in the innovative economy of the future. It's all the United States, and above all, China. And DeepSeek happens in China. It doesn't happen in Germany or England. And those economies, Germany is in recession now. Its GDP is negative, it's shrinking. It used to be the engine of Europe. In German, it's called Wirtschaftswunder. It's the economic miracle. Germany coming back, losing the 2 world wars, and now it's a basket case. It can't function. And the irony, it's their Americanism that killed them. When the United States decided to have this war in Ukraine, to set Zelensky up to fight the Russians with American money and American weapons, they demanded the fealty of the Europeans to provide money and to provide weapons, which they did. And since the military prospects weren't so good, they waged a sanctions war against Russia, the most important part of which was Europe's refusal to continue to buy cheap oil and gas from Russia, which is the world's second greatest source of cheap oil and gas. And to make the point clear, remember, they cut the underwater pipeline. Okay, so who's the biggest user of cheap oil and gas? Germany. Turns out the Wirtschaftswunder was because you had cheap energy, which nobody else could compete with because the Russians provided it at dirt cheap prices. So they refused. They had to turn then for their energy to the world market, including the United States, which now ships huge quantities of liquefied natural gas to the Europeans at a much higher price. The Germans can't compete. The German industry is leaving Germany. For the first time in 60 years, the number one company in Germany, Volkswagen, is closing factories and laying off thousands of workers, and therefore having enormous conflict with the powerful union. What's going on here? Is it possible, the whole world asks, that the Americans and the Europeans couldn't see that when you punish Russia with sanctions that stop you from buying oil and gas, that they will find someone else to sell it to? And maybe the BRICS that they're part of would have the Chinese and the Indians buy the oil and gas, which is what happened. That they didn't see it? Is the level of denial and delusion so deep that we're going to see one horrific horrific miscalculation like this after another? Everywhere in Europe, it is understood that the war in Ukraine is being lost, except here.
Before we return to some of those other rhetorical flourishes of Trump, I would like to talk about two domestic policies that I think really nicely bring together some of the other things we've been talking about, like oil, gas, energy, competition with the BRICS that are really trouncing us, and even the LA wildfires.
Yeah.
And that is Trump's climate change policies, because I mean, here are here's the sort of tangle that I see. One, it seems like climate change. I mean, some people on the right, for instance, don't believe that there is any,
Right.
but it might prove an existential issue for us, as evidenced by LA again, ostensibly. But then on the other hand, as far as economic competition goes, it seems like some of our competitors aren't beholden to the same climate change measures that we've been taking in the United States. And so repealing them might better enable us to compete with the countries to whom we're ceding our dominance.
There's a risk that the climate people are right, and that the rising temperature of the oceans and pollution levels are very dangerous for our future. There's a risk they're right. There's also a risk that the people who don't believe any of that are right. I agree. I don't know. First of all, I'm not such a scientist. I'm not up on all of that. I see a risk on both sides. But I must say, it seems obvious to me that we'd be better off not risking that the right wing is correct. Let's take the other one. Let's do the steps we think will help, because if it's right, it's our existence. Rather than play Russian roulette with the right wing and say, well, it's not certain, so let's not worry about it. I mean, what? Why would you do that? I don't understand. And when you look at who's spending the money to convince everybody, then it becomes obvious, doesn't it? It's Exxon and Mobil and all it's the right wing together with the big businesses that are funding them. So for me, oh boy. So on the one hand, we have alarmist scientists, I get it, and they may be alarmist beyond what's appropriate. That's possible. I understand. There's a risk that that's wrong. But on the other hand, I see self-interested corporations promoting something that holds on to the profit of their fossil fuel foundations, and people who are saying it might be wrong. But I'm saying, yeah, it might be wrong, but wouldn't we be better off taking steps to deal with it than not? I don't see what refutation there is to this. So I end up with the people who want to do stuff about it, who want to limit our... And since I see it dovetailing with other things, I think the private car is a ridiculous notion. We oughtn't to do that. The single largest polluter of air is the automobile exhaust. So, for me, let's have public transportation. Let's go back to the collective housing we once had back at the end of World War II, and that was a serious project here in the United States. Let's take the steps that would mitigate global warming and all the rest of it, because that's the path that makes more sense. And in order to say that, I don't have to denounce the people who are skeptical about all of it. I understand that. There's basis to be skeptical. I don't like the lineup of who's telling me to be skeptical, but I understand the skeptics may be right. I don't want to get into a position where I know scientific. I'm not going there. My liberal friends do that. They don't need me, and I don't agree with them anyway about it. For me, that's... Mr. Trump has made his decision. He panders to the fossil fuel. He panders to the audience that those companies have created for him. Because the establishment politically adopted at least a public commitment to climate control, attacking the establishment works if he attacks. He attacks, this is the elitists in California who give a shit about all of this. He is a one-trick pony, Mr. Trump. You could see it when they had the awful American Airlines Army helicopter crash in Washington, D.C. a few days ago, and Mr. Trump has to talk about it by blaming the diversity, equality, inclusion movement for having created the inadequate airport management.
That goes back to Victor Davis Hanson and Los Angeles wildfire response. The same idea that it's this left-wing ideological captured incompetence that has caused a lot of these
And they
issues.
captured air traffic controllers. Yeah. As I said, it's a one-trick pony. This is an attempt to make it. Look, when you asked me earlier, why do I do economics? I showed you that, I hope I did. I hope I showed you that I'm not arguing that economics is more important than anything else. I don't believe it is. I never had.
Mm-hmm.
I focus on it, no question, but not because it's the most important thing. I focus on it because it was the excluded, tabooed issue. And that drew me. And I still think that's the case. Americans are afraid of thinking and talking about the economics of things because of where it takes you and where the political end of that conversation is. I think that's why they hold back from it. But Hanson, that's a different argument. He focuses on, these elitisms or the because he really thinks that's the key item. He actually thinks the key item. I don't think the economics are the key item of anything, but I am struck by the exclusion of the economic dimension of things. It's extraordinary, and I'm going to talk about that because you don't want to. I think that has something to teach us, and I'm going to stress that. But I'm not going to say this is the cause. So if Hanson and I were debating, he would say this is why it happened, and because the elite, and then not me. I'm not going to. No, it didn't want that. It was this.
Well, if you're ever in the Bay Area again, maybe I could arrange.
I go there I go to the Bay Area as often as I can. I really find it a wonderful place. I like that city. I admit I like the climate. I like the ocean. It's just people are very friendly. It's a very attractive place for me, but New York City is also even doesn't have those qualities. I like New Orleans. I like New York. I like San Francisco.
The other thing I wanted to bring up right now isn't so much a policy issue, but just a broader domestic economic issue going forward, and one that I think your Marxist or Marxian, you've been using that word, analysis might be really helpful with. It also connects to DeepSeek, automation, electric vehicles, and that is the role of advancements in AI in the competition between China and the United States, and also just the overall health of our domestic workforce.
I don't know quite how to get at what it is I would want to say about that. China has demonstrated now, and I believe this is true to almost every reasonable person whether they like China or not, whether they support what China is or don't. They have demonstrated that economic growth can be achieved faster in their kind of system than it can in any other kind. And that is a momentous, that's a momentous achievement. Over the last 30 to 40 years, they have consistently grown, as measured by their GDP, 2 to 3 times faster than the United States. I must remind people, even though they hate to hear it, that before this speedy growth, the Soviet Union accomplished speedy growth. Not as fast, but speedy growth. So that the painful reality, so painful it can't be spoken, is that the 20th and 21st centuries demonstrated the growth potential and the growth actuality most effectively in the Soviet Union and China. If you look at the Soviet Union as the first experiment in what I'm about to describe as their economic system, and China as the second, right? Russia starts in 1917, China in 1949. That's quite a difference. But by now, we have 70 years, roughly 70 years of the Soviet Union, and now 70 years of China. And the Chinese growth faster, more spectacular than the Russian. The Russians were a system of state enterprises throughout industry and a growing proportion of state enterprises in agriculture. And very little scope for capitalist enterprises throughout that time. Not zero, that's an American fantasy, but small. China is completely different. China made a decision after Mao to become a hybrid, to be partly state-owned and operated enterprises, half, and the other half private capitalist enterprises, both Chinese and external allowed. So that I think it's fair to say that China represents a hybrid trying to combine both the benefits of a private capitalism model United States and of a state-owned and operated enterprise system, example, the Soviet Union. They really are a 50-50 split. With the hybrid of these two systems overseen by a communist party and a powerful state apparatus controlled by that party. And they've achieved really an unspeakable story. Let me give you one statistic just to put in your head. The GDP of the United States, 28 trillion bucks, more or less. The GDP of Russia, our former arch enemy, today is $3 or $4 trillion. No content, nothing. And that was always true. Only in the Cold War legacy mentality of the United States did Russia loom, silly economic nonsense. Anyway, that's not true with China. China's GDP now 18, 19, 20 trillion dollars. Way different from Russia, and equally so from anywhere else. Britain's GDP, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 trillion, something like that. Very small.
Bigger than Russia, though.
What?
Bigger than Russia.
Probably bigger than Russia, yeah. And Russia fighting NATO means Russia's fighting Britain, France, Germany, Italy is refusing. That's different. But look what China has done. China was one of the poorest countries on the planet in 1949 and is now number 2, unquestionably number 2 after the United States, and each year closing the gap. That is an astounding achievement. It is very, very hard for me not to dwell on it. But one of its components, and one of the reasons it has the achievement, will take us to the technology issue. A powerful Communist Party ruling a powerful state apparatus, supervising this hybrid, can do something quickly and efficiently that the United States either can't do or can't do quickly and efficiently. It can mobilize the entire economy to achieve certain priorities. It can mobilize the government sector in its ways and the private sector in its ways. It can force them to collaborate and coordinate so that the resources each has are brought together to attack a problem. It does not respect private profit as the priority, which is what happens here. It does not believe the private has to be given primacy in some sense, as happens here. It doesn't have a government filled with people who believe that the private is in some sense the more important, the more patriotic, the more deserving, the more what. It doesn't have any of that. In fact, it has the other. One of the elements of socialism or communism that has a real effect here is that the people involved in the public sector believe in it, respect it, even value it higher than the private. In recent years in China, you have seen programs punishing leading private capitalists, Jack Ma and others like that, kind of dressing them down, in some cases imprisoning them, but mostly culturally saying, you are not, yet we will let you be a billionaire. We will. And we will let you run your business. But when you overstep in this hybrid, we're going to give you a slap on the wrist or worse, because you're not, and there's enormous support in the public sector for that. Americans have a very hard time grasping how different this is. Here in the United States, just by comparison, the presumption is that government is a bureaucracy full of unnecessary people, the fat. Economic fat. So Mr. Trump gets a lot of support for nominating the head of a private bureaucracy, Mr. Musk, to clean out the public bureaucracy, as if him being the proprietor of another bureaucracy didn't disqualify him. What? Why? What are you doing? What are you doing? This man has an enormous bureaucracy. He has a business that spans the whole world, or multiple businesses that span the whole world. He's got a complicated, overlapping mess of the bureaucracy, like all bureaucracy. But no, 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 no. No. Instead, the mentality is the private bureaucracy is efficient, lean, effective. It's always the public bureaucracy that isn't, though. That's a completely different way of thinking about, and it translates into different little decisions along the way, made in this office in Idaho and that office in Vermont. And because of this private profit, a private public notion, it's remarkable. I think it enabled Xi Jinping, the current leader in China, to realize that the efforts of the United States to constrict and constrain China, focused as they were on, among other things, artificial intelligence, meant that in order to have a chance, China could mobilize its resources in a way that Europe could not. Europe didn't have the hybrid economic systems, way too much private, and they didn't have national unity, too much tension among the countries of the EU. So they could not mobilize, not across the public-private boundary, not across the national boundary. So they couldn't, and they didn't. But the Chinese, who had less of some kinds of resources than Europe, if you take Europe as a total, they could. And they're not going to change this because it's working. That's why they are able now to compete in AI. That's what the importance of the DeepSeek explosion was. It wasn't the details of one program versus another. These are they call learning modules. What this is about is a sign, which is, by the way, a number of American commentary made this, and they're right. They compared it to 1957. And because I'm old enough, I was alive then. I remember it. 1957 was when Russia, Soviet Union then, sent up a man in space, a Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin. I remember the name of the Russian astronaut who was there. And America went crazy because the whole notion that we were number one meant that we Americans would be the first in space. And here we're not just another country, that would have been bad enough, but the bad country had done it. This is comparable. It's a sign that a country we thought was far behind us isn't. And I think you've seen a kind of quasi-hysteria already in Washington as the whole establishment reinforces itself. No, stop. Even though the war in Ukraine is with Russia, we really should be focused on China. My guess, I don't know, of course, but my guess that if Mr. Trump delivers on his promise to end the war in Ukraine, he will do so in the name of focusing on the much greater danger represented by China. The truth of it is, the Chinese at this point are not our problem because they don't need, all they want is free trade. All they want is to be allowed to do in the future what they've done in the past. It's the United States that has to have a change because it's terrified by the growth that the Chinese have achieved and that they look likely to continue, and therefore they have to be stopped. So what Americans cannot understand, because they don't want to face it, is that it's not that the Chinese are aggressive. It's really the reverse. It's the United States that's aggressive because it needs to stop what's going on The Chinese don't. For the Chinese, let's go. We know how to go. We know how to beat you. We know how to grow. We do it better than you do. So just let us. And the United States says, we won't. We're going to stop you. We're going to slow you. And it's almost as naked as that, if you look at the press these days. And, it's a question of whether the Americans have the means. I don't think they do. And have the determination, they may have that, to stay with this policy. I like to remind them that after Britain tried twice to punish the United States for becoming independent, Revolutionary War, War of 1812, they gave up. And they basically worked out a deal. Americans would leave them alone and the rest of the world do their British Empire. And the British would respect that the United States now had an empire called the Monroe Doctrine. You can take this Western Hemisphere. We're taking everything else. And on that basis, we can all live happily together. And they did. They didn't go to war against each other since that time. Okay, so why not the United States sit down with China and do more or less the same? I don't understand why that isn't talked about. And I don't think that's because it isn't an option. I think it is. And I think Americans somewhere know that it is. But for the moment, they're all excited that they may have the ability just to blow the Chinese away, the way the Russians went away. And I think that's a mistake, but that's where we sit.
We're definitely going to come back to China because we need to end this conversation talking about the ultimate fate of the United States, and China is, of course, going to play a huge role in that. But there are still those two rhetorical issues that I wanted to talk about that we haven't gotten to yet. And I think the first one that you mentioned in our conversation is Greenland, and whether we need to take it from Denmark or... So what is the context here? Why would Trump... I mean, Greenland just seems like a non-entity. I don't really think about it that often, except we fly over it sometimes on our way to Europe. Why would Trump make this move? Was this a strategic move? What is he trying to get? Successful, unsuccessful?
There are multiple factors. It's never, ever reducible to one. It's multiple. Saber rattling against a tiny country like Denmark is a tasteless piece of bluster. So I assume part of what's going on here is it's just bluster. It's just Mr. Trump this is something nobody would say or do in the modern world. You don't have relationships between countries handled in this way. It's just not done. And so he does it. So that's one thing that's going on here. Number two, he wants, and the argument is now getting stronger because of it, he seems to want to disrupt and dismember and destroy NATO. Because this certainly makes NATO look like nothing if it goes through. It already makes it look like nothing that this could even happen. Now that's a whole conversation. What would the logic be? But I remind you of what I said earlier. I can tell you a logic for why Mr. Trump might want to get rid of NATO. But I would be articulating something further and better than anything he has said or anyone speaking for him has said. So I'm not sure it's me trying to come up with a strategical rationale. I mean, it would be me doing it, but I would have no way of knowing whether or not something like this is in the minds of because they're not saying anything like that, so who knows? I don't see in him the strategic logic. Third, there already are U.S. military bases in Greenland. They've been there for years. So the notion that this is a security, there's not the slightest evidence that anybody else is encroaching, whatever that might mean, on the U.S. bases. The Danish government has not said a word to indicate that it doesn't want them. On the contrary, in the days since Trump started, they have offered more bases to the United States than they already have. So I don't see. He says it's national security. I have no idea. If you're looking for the Chinese, they don't have any role there particularly. So could they come one day? Yeah, but that's true anywhere. They could come one day and sit outside the harbor in any country on earth. So I find it very bizarre. Does Mr. Trump want to have the privilege for his sons to grab property and start building hotels and golf courses?
In Greenland?
Yes. You know what the argument there is? Which Mr. Trump has articulated.
Oh, really? I missed that.
Not this time. Earlier.
Okay.
He articulated the argument that, you'll love this, climate change, which he doesn't believe in, means that it's getting warmer. And Greenland will be melting its ice. And more of Greenland will become livable.
That's a nice little contradiction.
Yes, you like that one? And he said this, he wants to build hotels and golf courses. By the way, that's what he does. Doesn't do it well. Lots of them are losing money, but he does that. He likes that. Sort of the real estate patrician's notion of having arrived. So that might be, he can make sure as president that his kids get the prime real estate rather than the shitty real estate, whatever. So when I make those arguments, since nobody else has expressed any interest, there's no competitive, Britain or Denmark, and nobody that I know of is eager for Greenland. So I go back to the beginning. This is Mr. Tough Guy. And if I were going to play amateur psychologist, not just for Mr. Trump, but for the establishment here in the United States, then I'd come up with the following. To do the four things at once that he did, I'm going to take Panama Canal, I'm going to take Greenland, I'm going to make Canada the 51st state, and I'm going to
rename the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, not so much that. I'm going to hit Mexico with tariffs, deportation. Then this is classic American politics. That's nationalism. It's the glorification of the nation as the power that rules the world. We're going to do this to this country and this to that country. It goes with the territory. It's what a leader should do. Mr. Trump said at the night of the election, when he couldn't claim a mandate, he talked a lot about unity. Presidents usually do after elections.
There hasn't been much unity.
No, there hasn't been, and there hasn't been even much talk. He did it the night of the election, and not much after that. Not much talk. Well, the country can get united around its empire. And we're sticking it to Panamanians, Danes, Canadians, and Mexicans. See that? We Americans are, our leader, this.
Well, that does seem like a good strategic move if it helps bolster support for him by uniting people under a nationalistic.
I think people are now sufficiently. I think we are sufficiently weaned away from the neoliberal globalization period, when an enormous effort was made to teach us to be okay with factories running away because the global economy would deliver goods and services more cheaply than otherwise, and everybody wins from this one. Never true, but a nice story to tell. We've been weaned off of it, so now it's okay. The president can give billions to this industry, billions to that industry, hit the market with all of the stuff about don't tax out the window. All of the stuff about the free market, don't interfere in the free. He's interfering every day. His tariff is an interference in the free. I mean, it is the taboo, the Republican taboo. We won't tax. We don't interfere in the free market, and thereby we make your life better. It was always bullshit, but it was their bullshit. Many elections won by Republicans were won because they promised either not to raise taxes or to cut them. They are the anti-tax. And now they've become the pro-tax party. Like they've become what? Free market. F the free market. We don't like this. We don't like this. We're going to interfere this way here. We're going to interfere that way over there. Taking countries is not leading things to the free market. You are not doing that. It's a nationalist turn, and it will be justified on the same grounds that nationalist turn always have been, which is threat from abroad. And you can then articulate it as fentanyl coming into your country. That's one threat abroad. Or vague, aggressive actions by the Chinese, which, the Chinese go out of their way to say, we don't want to interfere in any of this. We just let us grow. So I think China has figured out the bottom line, how to mobilize its resources to achieve its priority targets. And the number one priority target has been rapid economic development, and they've achieved it better, sooner than even they imagined, nor did anyone else outside foresee or even keep up with. When I began to pay attention to the Chinese economy, which in my case was in the 1960s and 70s, for 2 or 3 decades after that, every piece of work, and I wrote my master's thesis on the Chinese economy at Stanford, where I did it. You always were told, here's the statistic you're looking for, but you can't count on the Chinese. I mean, they're probably making it up. No matter what their achievement was, including achievements like going to major cities in China. I don't know if you've been, and seeing that these are very modern cities with rapid transit that's better than that of the United States and so on. No matter what people saw, they needed to say that the statistics are manipulated, are hyped in one way or another. Now people have stopped doing it because, in the end, you can see what they're capable of doing. They have the equivalent of Alphabet, Google, Apple, Intel, all have their counterparts in China, plus an explosion of small companies. By the way, I meant to mention that one of the nice things that DeepSeek shows Americans who are willing to look at it is that the notion that there's a significant difference between socialism and communism, because communism provides incentives and capitalism provides incentives, and capitalism doesn't regulate, and capitalism therefore stimulates efficiency, that China, if you assume it's socialist, which is what it calls itself, socialism, well, obviously, they're not holding back entrepreneurialism. DeepSeek, like many other, is an entrepreneur. DeepSeek, as an enterprise, was formed in May of 2023. It's a 1.5-year-old new startup.
Wow.
The Chinese call it a startup. They borrow the American name, a startup. So, and there's lots of companies like that. There's about 30, if I have it right, about 30 companies working on electric vehicles. So it's not it's not monopoly companies the way we have here. It's actually easier to start a business and to grow a business. I can't tell you how many people that I talk to in the United States have what the French call an idée fixe, a fixed notion that one of the virtues of capitalism relative to socialism is that it spawns and favors innovation.
I would have been one of those people.
Yes, it spawns and favors efficiency. It allows entrepreneurs to. The Chinese do all of that. They always have, but where did this come from? This is pure propagandistic. Even if it had a grain of truth, I'm not aware it does, but it may, that I'm not aware of. It's not some fixed, it's silly. This guy who started DeepSeek, May of 23, he had a background of he had a technical background, but he was also active in finance. He straddled these two. And he saw an opportunity, and he got together a group of engineering type, recent graduates, as I told you. I made a little firm and went to work on a project. That's what he did, which is the story of a startup in Silicon Valley, multiplies 50 times or 1,000 times, whatever it is. But you have that there too. And it's common sense if you think about it. The Chinese prioritize economic growth. They're practical people in the same way Americans were. So they said, of course, one of the things we have to do is look at the United States, figure out how they did it, and go them one better if we can. Everybody does that. And that's what they did. But they have enough people and enough resources and enough capability to mobilize them to do it. So in a way, they figured it out. The stilted old socialism is clunky and cumbersome. The government is everywhere. It's childish. It's that head in the sand mentality. If things don't develop the way you thought they would, then you ought to go back to the drawing board and wonder about your assumptions, because you thought this, but this happened, all right? Socialism isn't innovative. Okay, the Chinese have the best electric cars. The Chinese have a new AI. The Chinese, they innovated. Well, they copy. Yes, there was some copying going on, no doubt. They stole some of the technology, probably. But, if you know anything about history, that's really not relevant. Everybody who can steals. Everybody who can copies. But the Chinese have done that, and the folks in Belgium haven't. And the folks in Italy haven't, and the folks in Germany haven't, and the folks in England haven't. Whoa, whoa. And the Americans thought they were years ahead, and then it turns out they're not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then it's time to ask yourself, since we've touched on Marxism, here's another parallel. When the Soviet Union collapses, the first national experiment in a socialist economy, Marxists were confronted with a really serious problem, because what was done in Russia was done in the name of Marxism. We are Marxists building a socialist economy. So the Russians had a real serious problem. You fell apart. The thing you created wasn't sustainable. We have the proof. It's gone. It fell apart. Everybody who wasn't a Marxist piled in and said, you failed because socialism doesn't work. I don't know, kind of a quickie summary of the story. Now, the Marxists either had to come up with their own alternative explanation, or they'd be stuck with a very bad result, because the argument of the rest of the world, or much of it, was that here is the proof that socialism isn't innovative. It doesn't allow build the business. Socialism doesn't work, right? And it forced Marxists to go back and say, what did we get wrong? What did we not see? We didn't see that this experiment would fall apart. Not even by some outside invasion or war. None of it. It just fell apart. We missed something. We better ask pretty basic questions about our analytical framework, Marxism. Or to say the same thing in other words, Marxists had better come up with their own explanation of what happened, or else the notion that socialism doesn't work will kind of take the day. It will have won the debate. And so a variety of people, myself included, did that. I spent 10 years of my life writing a book with my colleague Stephen Resnick, a man that I worked with, also a professor of economics like me. We spent 10 years writing a book on what happened to the Soviet Union. Why did it fall apart? And what does that tell us? And the bottom line, your audience might be interested. The book is available. It's in print. You can get it.
What's it called?
What's called? Theory, wrong title. Theory and History, Capitalism and Communism in the USSR. So published by Routledge, a big international publishing house. Routledge, available in English all over the world. Been translated into a bunch of other languages too. Anyway, here's what we found, just to give you an idea of how basic we asked the question, which is what I'm demanding in a sense of people who misunderstood where the United States was going relative to China. We came to the conclusion that the notion of socialism and communism had been taken in a direction after Marx's death by his followers that we believe produced an unfortunate outcome. And the outcome was that socialists thought that what they were about was to go beyond capitalism in the sense of depriving private owners of the means of production, private entrepreneurs, from their position and their power in order to collectivize, to make the economy something the community as a whole undertakes, not private subgroups, because of the contradiction. Simple idea that if a private group of people are running an enterprise, they run it to maximize that enterprise, not the needs of society, and that those don't always work out, and that the society's needs can go unfulfilled because the privates don't do what you would need to do to fill them. An old idea fleshed out in a century of writing by socialists, mostly in the 19th century. And so they ended up with a tension between the private enterprise and the state as the representative of the community as a whole, which should, and Russia makes a revolution, gets rid of the private enterprises and replaces them with state-owned and operated. So that indeed the whole 20th century is an endless debate between the private and the public. Capitalism, United States, private, versus socialism, Soviet Union, public. What we concluded, make a long story short, what we concluded was that Marx's insight was not primarily about public versus private. To say the thing bluntly so the idea gets across, Marx didn't give a crap whether the production was done by private or public.
That's surprising to me.
That's not what... If you look through the 3 volumes of Capital, which is really the mature work that he leaves, I mean, lots of other valuable stuff, but that's the core, those 3 volumes.
And one day you and I are going to go over that in detail.
Absolutely. I spend most of my adult life teaching that. As a professor, I've taught people volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Capital. So for those that are interested, if you find what I have to say about the American economy interesting, this may trouble you. I'm just applying Marxist economics. Don't thank me. It's Marx. And if that's new and interesting to you, I'm pleased. But it tells us more about what you didn't learn in your life than anything else. It's been there for all. Anyway, if you look at volume 1, which is the only of the 3 volumes that Marx himself actually wrote, volumes 2 and 3 occurred after Marx was dead and gone, was put together volume 2 by his colleague Friedrich Engels, and volume 3, because Engels was then dead, by a German Marxist who came after them named Karl Kautsky. So, because I teach this stuff, I know this stuff, right? So volume 1, what Marx lays out there is a critique of the capitalist way of organizing an enterprise, not whether it's state or private. You will not find in Capital anything about that. It's not about whether state or private is better or worse this way. That's not, Marx not interested in that. Never was. Barely wrote about the state. His work was what in Capital? Focused on the enterprise. If I wanted to use modern language, I'd say Marx is a critic of the microeconomic level of capitalism, not so much the macro, the micro. What goes on in the enterprise? And his argument there is that the capitalist enterprise is governed by, defined by, the juxtaposition, the relationship between the folks who run the enterprise, the owner, the top manager, the board of directors, if you have a corporate form, and the mass of employees. That this relationship of capitalism demonstrates that it didn't make the break from slavery and feudalism that it thought it did. Master-slave, lord-serf, employer-employee. And that the root of the problems of capitalism are right there. That's a problem. That way of organizing creates hostility, animosity, introduces inefficiency on a staggering basis, and then it blows up. And so if you want to make a transition from capitalism to something really different, you have to do it at the level of the enterprise. Not that you don't talk about public and private, that's fine, collective, individual, all that's perfectly part of a story. You better include the core. And the core is, have you been willing, and now I'm going to use language for Americans to point hard, are you a Democrat with a small d, or are you not? Do you believe in democracy, or do you not? Because if you do, it has to start in the enterprise. One person, one vote. Everybody in the business has an equal say in what happens, because you're all affected by the decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the product. You're all affected in an enterprise by those decisions. But in capitalism, you're excluded if you're an employee from making them. Those are made by the employer, as they were in feudalism and slavery by lord and master. Therefore, the core of socialism would have to include, whatever else it is, the transformation of the enterprise from the capitalist hierarchical system to a worker co-op system. That was not done in Russia, and it wasn't done in China either. So that's the issue. That's what's going to be fought out this century, that question.
Speaking of this century, we're nearing the end of our conversation, so I wanted to shift back toward what we can expect going forward. And I think in our last two conversations, we've used this word, prognosticator, soothsayer, and we've agreed that you're not a prognosticator, you're not a soothsayer, but you do have
Nor is anyone else.
But you have a tremendous wealth of historical information, economical information, and if anything gives us a hint about what's to come, those are two of those things. So I'm wondering, maybe with particular reference to China, to Donald Trump, to other global states of affairs, what are you expecting out of the next 4 years?
What I'm expecting, and I want to underscore, I mean, you're quite right, but I want to underscore, I'm not predicting, I don't have that power, I don't think anybody does. I believe Mr. Trump is going to be overwhelmed by history. Nor is he alone in that. That has happened to most other political leaders. They, and often their adoring publics, overestimate how much they can do, how much they understand. So I expect him to be overwhelmed. Overwhelmed by the decline of the empire, which is continuing, by the mounting economic problems in the United States because of the declining empire in part, and because we have as a nation a level of ideological obfuscation, I'll be polite, that makes it hard for Americans to honestly face their problems and come to grips with them. And in some sense, that's our own fault as a people, but between that and the forces at work, Mr. Trump doesn't have the insights, and I don't just mean him, but his group, his team, or whatever you want to call it. They don't have the insights that I see. They don't have the tools that I can see to deal with the problems that I can see. So I think he will be overwhelmed. Things will work out in a way he did not want and did not foresee. That certainly happened to Mr. Biden. It certainly happened to Mr. Trump at the end of his first race. And since he's a person given to doubling down, he tried to be more in the second time than he was in the first time, but along very similar lines, only more so. And I don't think that's going to solve any of the problems. except by accident. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. He's going to be throwing Hail Mary passes often. And you know what happens? Most of the time, those don't work very well. Sometimes they do. And that's the best he can do. And that's not so different from others, but it's been my experience that the situation shapes the leader far more than the other way around. And I know that goes against more heroic notions, but that's what I see. The United States is going to have to come to terms with a reduced position in the world. It has been doing that poorly for some years now, so on one level, it's a continuation. But I am a Hegelian, and I understand that quantitative decline at a certain point becomes a qualitative shift. You know, with the old model, rising temperature of water until it, at a certain point, becomes gas. Or the other way, it becomes a solid with ice. At a certain point, the adjustment downward of the American economy is going to shake the society by imposing a qualitative shift. I see the United States, if you want to argue it a little differently, as headed in the direction of wealthy enclaves surrounded by a sea of people in pretty tough economic circumstances. That used to be the way the rest of the world, or much of it, looked. That's coming home to the United States.
That's interesting.
And I think Mr. Trump has cashed in on that phenomena. He's cashed in on the upset that this is already creating when you get hints of all of this. But he is still able to cash in on it politically. Let me give you an example. He can't control even what happens in Mexico and Canada, so he has to be aggressive. And he has to do what doesn't matter because he can't do what does. He wants to control Central America. He can't. He just can't. But what he can do is insist on changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico. What does that do? It's the same the next day after the name is changed. It's got the same trade, the same movement of people, the same set of ecological vulnerability. What's it for? I mean, it's clearly an affront to Mexicans, which you have to answer again the question, what is the... Oh, it aggrandizes. Whoa. This game. But that's usually the sign of a weakness, not a strength. This is a posturing about something that you can do, even though it doesn't matter, because you don't want people to understand what you can't do. It's the old moment in the Western film when the outlaws have ridden into town, shot up the bank, stole every nickel in it, and are riding out of town just as the sheriff arrives, late, having failed in his function. But he says with great intensity, "Round up the usual suspects," and he goes after the mouth. What is this? He's covering over his failure. The town doesn't want him to go get the bad guys. He wants the bad guys not to come in, the town does, and not to do the damage. He failed to do, but he's going to show. Mr. Trump can do the reshoring of America. He can do it. Every president of the last 10 has promised to bring manufacturing back here. None of them succeeded. That's a clue. He's not going to either. But he will tell you how he can do what they all failed to do. Sure you can. Sure you can. And if you would like, I have this bridge between Manhattan and Brooklyn that I will sell you a share in. And you being a real estate mogul, you for sure will be gullible enough to give me a few bucks for it. I know. So I don't think much is going to change. We're going to continue pretty much as we are. He is going to enjoy poking liberal sensibilities by being outrageous with immigrants, which will hurt many people, by putting a tariff, which will hurt our economy in a whole host of ways. When the bad results happen, he will be right there to blame somebody else. So if there's a crash of airplanes, it's the bad people who want diversity and inclusion, right? Which has gone in a record short time from being something everybody nodded for because it's good to now everybody's supposed to know it's bad, causes air crashes. No, this is childish. But it's a dangerous childishness because it means you're not looking at what's really quite in front of you. I can see it, one last point, with the deep seek. All these are, I don't know if you're aware, but in the day after they came up with it, their entire computer system was hacked and destroyed. I mean, they'll fix it, they know how. But somebody wants to shut them down. I'll give you 3 guesses who it are, but the first 2 guesses don't count. So you get 1 guess. These are attempts to stop. You can't stop this. You can't. That's the history of technology. We invented patents and copyrights to try to make it illegal, to slow down what always happens, which is copying. And in a sense, isn't that what we want? We want people to make the next step so that we can't just slow down the cancer. Maybe we can cure it, but to develop the cure, let's see what we would be able to do with the. Well, you don't want people to do that? What? That never works. People find a way around that. The sanctions that we imposed on Russia, the world found ways around it. Russia still sells oil and gas in Europe, believe it or not. But the Russian gas has to go to India and change the ship and go to that. And there are ways around. There always were, and there are now. The whole thing about the sanctions was mostly for show, to show Americans, look, we're beating them, we're hitting them with a F-16, and we're hitting them with we're losing. We're hitting. It's the sheriff. He wasn't there. That's a failure. No. Look at how we're chasing the usual suspects. A nation has to, at some point, grow up. The United States has to, at some point, kind of grow up and look at these things and not leave it to a relatively small number of folks like me. Luckily, I'm far from alone. A lot of folks who are willing and able to stand up and say, hey, there's another emperor here who's actually naked. That little boy in the story, we need a lot more little boys. And my hope is, and it's not just my hope, I see it. I want to end on that because, for example, the labor movement that we talked about earlier with the decline for 50 years is turning up. It's turning up. Many of us wondered if it ever would, but it is. Some of the poorest paid workers, some of those undocumented immigrants included, are not willing to work at Starbucks under the conditions of that employment, or at Amazon warehouses, or at fill in the blank, at the fast food joints. They are forming unions, a lot of them. They're having strikes. They're developing new strategies. And I know it's not just among the lowest paid. Teachers are doing it around the country. Medical personnel out in California, the Kaiser Permanente people. Extraordinary solidarity across unions, among workers. That's, for me, very, very hopeful and positive sign. My biggest regret about these things is only that they're not further along than they are. The United States needs a new, fresh, left-wing political party. This uncomfortable coexistence inside the Democratic Party with a centrist establishment absolutely determined to crush anything that comes from its left wing, whether it be Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or any of the others. This is silly. This doesn't work. There ought to be an alternative. Bernie Sanders, when you ask him, will tell you that he knows that the people who he attracted were the people who ended up voting for Trump in large numbers.
Well,
they didn't want the establishment. But going to the right was only because there was no other place to go. Bernie was crushed by the centrists, pushed out. So he couldn't offer himself. Trump did to the middle of the Republican Party, namely wipe them out, what Bernie didn't try and didn't achieve if he did try. Okay, that's an imbalance that has to be faced, and let's ask the question. Why does a country that celebrates the freedom of choice limit the political to 2? Was it the magic number? Most other countries have more than 2 political parties that contest, including most of our European allies. We have 2. We don't need freedom of choice in politics. What? Where's that written? What? Why do we permit the 2 parties to make it impossible for third parties to get going, which they systematically do, and many of them will tell you how they do it and are committed to it? Because we live this strange public opinion in America that we're the nation of freedom. We want freedom of choice. Just not there. Ooh. It's like when I explain to my European friends, why do most American cities have 1 newspaper? We want freedom of choice. We just want 1. Why should we have 5? In every village in France, you can go into the local center, as many do, get your cup of espresso, and sit there reading the paper. And so you pick up a copy of the paper in any French village, and what can you get? On the liberal left end, Le Monde, their New York Times. If you don't like that, you get a national right-wing paper called Le Figaro. And next to it on the shelf is L'Humanité, Humanity. That's the daily newspaper of the French Communist Party. And it is not unusual to see someone sitting there who's got all 3 of them. Because they want to see how the news is treated differently by the communists and the right-wing conservatives and the liberal left socialists. That's what they actually want and enjoy the freedom of choice that Americans pretend to be committed to. This is weird. It may not strike anyone, but that's because it's really weird and you haven't thought about it before. And that's a strange quality of the United States. This not goes back to the beginning of our conversation. When I told you that I got interested in economics, because when I asked questions in college about economics, I could see, particularly when it had to do with revolution or socialism or Marxism, I could see the fear in my teacher's eye. But I learned to respect the fear because it was better than what I often found. Complete ignorance. They couldn't answer the question. They had no idea what Marxist criticisms were. They had been so traumatized as they were coming up in the education system that they understood not only was it not smart to say something Marxist, it was not smart to know anything. Don't read it. Don't go find a teacher to teach you. Don't. Just amazing. You're going to study capitalism. You're going to study all the people who love it. And you're going to exclude all the people who don't, who find it insufficient or bad. What kind of an education, what kind of a society does that? This is really, how do you make it better if you don't have people with the criticism having a conversation, showing you, this could be better. Don't you want that? Not if you're scared enough. Not if you have revved up no. We make fun or criticism of societies that burn the books. I used to say to my teacher, I guess America doesn't have to burn the books because you won't read them in any case. And they would grin and smile. They got the joke, but they didn't go read the book.
Let me say a few things. One, Rick, I have been greedy and I have kept you for far too long.
God, yeah.
But this has been amazing. You always manage to outdo yourself, and I and our listeners, I'm sure, are extremely grateful for this conversation. So thank you so much.
I hope so. I appreciate your keeping at it. I appreciate you translate or transform all of these things into things that can be understood. I don't have much power, but the power to affect the conversation is the best I can do. And you become a crucial partner in that, which I hope is satisfying to you as well as we do this.
So. Thank you.
But I mean it. I really do mean it.